Chapter 9:57. Lu Xiaoyi used the repulsive force of the meteorite to project himself. Actually, he still had some things that he didn't tell Xia Bingji. For example, there were perfected monarchs here. Since there was so much spiritual opportunity, how could it escape the senses of the perfected monarchs? In the void of the universe, no one would talk to you about bullying the weak. Previously, they might still be putting on airs and keeping a straight face. However, once the Tao collapsed, they would immediately reveal their true colors. Killing the yuanying of one's enemy was equivalent to killing the enemy's hope, even if the hope was infinitely small. His speed was strengthened in the void of the universe. Tens of thousands of stars were pulled without any blind spots. His body's abnormal strength allowed him to display the characteristics of a sword to the extreme in the void of the universe. It was as if he could teleport endlessly. This was the biggest reason why he dared to boldly walk out of the universe. It wasn't just his sword techniques. In the void of the universe, running was the way of the king. The entire cultivation system that he had established when he was in the foundation establishment stage only showed its true power when he was in the yuanying. Thankfully, he survived and didn't die in front of the yuanying. The direction of the search was in the direction of the Huiwei. He was very clear that these native cultivators only had one goal: to kill the people of Zhouxian. Their main goal was still to find spiritual opportunity. Their own cultivation was always the most important. This was the principle. Therefore, one could only follow the tail of the comet and walk in the direction where there was more spiritual opportunity. It was impossible to go in the opposite direction and walk from the middle of the comet to the tail where there was less spiritual opportunity. This was the subconscious behavior of cultivators. He only needed to guard against the cultivators who came from the Huiwei. As for the perfected monarchs, they might not be interested in the Huiwei's Yuqing. They might be more willing to find the Ziqing in the Huiwei. That was what they really needed. Time passed by as the two worked together. Xia Bingji focused on gathering spiritual opportunity. Although the meteorite was small, it was densely packed with spiritual opportunity. She had her work to do. Lu Xiaoyi, on the other hand, was sweeping back and forth in the periphery. Not only did he sweep the remaining 7 people, but he also swept the other strange guests, and even the people of Zhouxian. When you came to the void of the universe, you couldn't be merciful and think that the cultivators of Zhouxian should be your allies. This was very childish. If any other cultivator were to discover the rich spiritual opportunity on the meteorite, they would definitely be tempted. Rather than being forced to kill someone, it would be better to kill them directly. If he was alone, he might not have made such a cruel choice. However, if there was a woman dragging him down, he had to ensure the absolute safety of the two of them. He would not place his hopes on someone else's moral integrity. This was the difference between him and Xia Bingji. It was the difference in professionalism. He gave him a deadline of 1 year, but this was just a judgment. The situation could change at any time. 8 months later, Xia Bingji felt that someone was approaching the meteorite. The next moment, Lu Xiaoyi descended from the sky. "Senior sister, how much spiritium have you collected?" Xia Bingji threw over a storage ring. 2,100 jade purity and 180 strands of purple purity. "Your share is here." "Are you leaving?" "It hasn't even been a year." Lu Xiaoyi nodded. "I'm leaving." The frequency of foreign cultivators appearing was too high. If it was just for a battle, of course, we could still fight. However, if it was for a spiritual gathering, there was no need to be entangled. It seems that the location of this comet has been spread. A large number of cultivators are rushing here. The natives and the people from Zhouxian are among them. I hate eating with others. Let's find another place. The universe is so big. There is no need to hang on a tree. You like to eat alone. Where are we going? Are we going to the depths of the comet? Or are we leaving the comet? Xia Bingji had no objection. She was very clear about this guy's temperament. If he was alone, he would definitely stay here and fight with others. The reason why he wanted to leave now was because of her. In a battle in the universe, the advantage of having more people was great. However, the prerequisite was that they had to be able to take care of each other. If one of them was obviously weaker, 1 + 1 would be less than 1. She was finally clear about her own position. In fact, it did not matter if her combat strength was average. It was not where her interest lay. Why force it? Why not work hard on her own specialty and leave the fighting to those who were talented in it? There was nothing to be ashamed of. Being independent did not mean that she had to be independent in everything. She only needed to take care of the parts that were within her ability in the huge war chariot that was the haunting Taoism. Lu Xiaoyi explained, "We can't stay here in the meteorite magnet. It's too inconvenient to go in and out. It's not easy for our opponents to come in. It's also troublesome for us to go out. The deeper we go into the comet, the higher the possibility of bumping into a true monarch. Well, I'm still not strong enough to fight against them. My arms and legs are so small. Let's just leave the comet and go to the universe." Xia Bingji covered her mouth and laughed. "That's good. I thought you didn't even care about true monarchs now." The two of them packed up and began to float, allowing the meteorite magnet to push them. They gradually accelerated and spun until they reached a speed where they could leave. Lu Xiaoyi naturally hugged Xia Bingji's waist. The woman did not struggle. She knew very well that Lu Xiaoyi was worried that she would not be able to control her flying posture perfectly if the two of them were thrown out by the acceleration. So, he was fully in control. It did not matter. It was not as if he had not hugged her before. After 3 rounds, they felt that their speed had reached the extreme. Then, their bodies became light and the restraint was gone. The next moment, the two of them shot out like fragments from a star explosion. Xia Bingji only felt that there were countless meteorites in front of her. Such a speed of escape was completely beyond her imagination. If she was careless and collided with a group of meteorites, even someone as strong as Yuanying would not be spared. How to maintain speed and avoid collision while flying in a group of meteorites was a test of a cultivator's ability. She might not even pass in this aspect, but now she knew how a top student operated. Just a hair's breadth away, dancing on the tip of a knife. Countless times, she thought that she was going to collide with a meteorite, but in fact, there were countless times where she was scared but not in danger. When she began to feel that her speed was gradually slowing down, she had already left the magnetic storm area of the spindle and started to fly rapidly in the space of the comet tail. After experiencing the density of the magnetic storm area, such a dense group of meteorites in the space of the comet tail was nothing at all. Controlling the sword. For the first time, she felt the horror of a top swordsman controlling the sword. There was no way to fight. There was no way to aim. It was difficult to lock on with divine sense. Xia Bingji reminded herself that when she returned, she would have a good talk with her master about this problem. She would try to get her master's support on the relationship with Yaoying Sword Palace and Xiao Yaoyu. She would try her best to avoid offending this guy on the level of the sect. Who would be able to survive in the universe after offending such a person? Chapter 958. P.S. I'm lying in front of the computer, trying my best to type. I can only see 2 pieces. I'm mumbling to myself. Monthly subscription, come to this old man's bowl. 10 days later, the two rushed out of the comet and disappeared into the vast universe. 5 rings, dome peak. Swords were coming and going. It was getting busier and busier. For hundreds of years, the sword vein was getting more and more prosperous. In fact, it wasn't just the sword vein. The entire cultivation world was thriving. The orthodox Taoists and Buddhists were even more prosperous than the sword vein. This wasn't normal. The Jindan cultivators were ushering in their best era. But for the high-level cultivators, they saw more hidden dangers. The probability of reaching the nascent soul realm had almost doubled. The reason behind this was very thought-provoking. For Xian Yuan, including the 5 rings, even if the Yuanying cultivators were in a state of eruption, their demand for resources was not urgent. This was because they had been snatching for thousands of years. They flew and snatched all the way. Their resources were extremely abundant. It was as if they already knew that the end of the world was coming. Because the boundaries were not fixed, the 5 rings was always drifting. So there was always a new airspace waiting for them. It was not like Zhou Xian, where the inner and outer airspace was empty. Their inner and outer airspace was always changing. This gave the five rings Yuanying a great advantage in gathering spiritual opportunity. The newcomers didn't need to fly too far to harvest spiritual opportunity. For the time being, the problem of resources was not a headache for the higher-ups of the five rings. What they were worried about was an unforeseen event that even they couldn't control. On this day, the Crow Peak was full of heroes and supremes. Those who stayed at the mountain gate were all here. They were all silent, as if they were waiting for something. Sun God Supremes Guandu, Bai, and Xingshi were at the head. Below them were a large group of people, including Inner Sword Supremes Zhizhong, Gong Cheng, and Lufeng. Outer Sword Supremes Gong Yao, Zhou Jiong, and Rui Supremes. This was very rare for the Xianyuan swordsmen, who had always been plundering and roaming the universe for a living. This was a trend. Since the collapse of merit, the Supremes began to return. It was not just the Xianyuan sword faction. The collapse of the Tao was something that all cultivators in the universe could feel, like a message to the cultivators who received it. Sword Vein, Taoists, and Buddhists were all the cultivators. This was a major event that was related to the foundation of the cultivation world in the universe. Of course, it was also closely related to each orthodoxy. When the epoch changed, there would be a rise and a fall. Countless ambitious cultivators bared their fangs. For example, a top sword vein like Xianyuan, of course, they had to find the most suitable path for themselves. They could not afford to be careless. Information gathered from all directions, from the orthodox Taoists to the half-immortals. But there was one thing. There was no news from the immortal court, not even a word or a hint. It was not only the ancestors of Xianyuan who were like this, but also the ancestors of the three pure ones. This strange silence made everyone feel uncertain. They could only guess. Fortunately, the top forces of the fifth ring had deep foundations in the half-immortals level. These cultivators who were closest to the immortal court were the closest to the truth. The swordsmen were very silent. In this series of changes, the Xianyuan sword faction was once again pushed to the forefront of the storm. Because the source of the change of the Tao was with them. If the epoch changing was a curtain, then the one who pulled it open was the Xianyuan swordsman. Regardless of whether they admitted it or not, this was what everyone thought. What did this mean? It meant that during the epoch changing, the sword vein would either soar to the sky or fall forever. Therefore, although they were silent, there was an indescribable surge of power in this silence. This was a great era. The Crow ancestor had given them a chance to stand on the stage of the entire universe. How would they express themselves? The future was bright, and the path was full of twists and turns. The pressure was as great as a mountain. They had already waited on Crow Peak for a whole year. None of them said anything. If the change did not appear, they would continue to wait like this. It was not only the Dome Peak. The three pure ones Longhuan Cave, the Supreme Amethyst Mountain, and Sungashinu Lake also had a large number of perfected monarchs gathering there. Suddenly, the universe became silent. This was something that only cultivators and those who were connected to the heavenly Tao could sense. Foundation Establishment Jean Dan could sense it. The sharp ones could even sense it. However, they did not know why. Only grand cultivators, especially perfected monarchs, could make an accurate judgment. In the momentary silence, something shattered. It was one of the rules of the Tao. It's the great void. Gong Yao sighed. After morality, destiny, and merit, another Khanate Tao shattered. It had only been a short 300 years since the fragment of merit. The great void was Qi, the main body of the Bai. The nether heart returned to the great void. Heaven and earth had the same lifespan. 10,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 300 years ago. Is the collapse of the Tao accelerating? A perfected monarch murmured. Guandu reprimanded. He had to correct some of the perfected monarch's thoughts. Otherwise, they would be confused by the collapse of the Tao and uncontrollably do some inexplicable things. It's not accelerating. It's disorder. The collapse of the Tao can't happen every few years or decades. The heavenly Tao universe cannot withstand continuous upheavals. This is the foundation. A few days ago, the unspeakable place sent a warning. It's because it's afraid that we will lose our minds because of this. In the future, the collapse of the Tao will take at least 200 to 300 years. It's the norm. Ji Zhong was a little depressed. Great Void. Is there a Tao realm direction in my Xianyuan sword vein that's Great Void? Anyway, I know that there isn't an internal sword vein. Gong Yao, do you have an external sword vein? Gong Yao was also very depressed. There seems to be one or two, but I'm not sure. The uncertainty of the Yuanying Tao realm direction during the nascent soul stage was not due to his negligence as the pavilion master of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion. In fact, many cultivators did not have a complete grasp of their Tao realm direction during the nascent soul stage. Yuanying was only a relay station on the Tao realm, not the final destination. It's just that many cultivators would eventually fall at this relay station. The direction of the Tao realm could still be changed after the Yuanying Tao realm. Many of the perfected monarchs present had experience in this aspect. Guandu waved his hand. No matter. Spread the news. Let everyone choose for themselves. If there's a need, they can go outside and try their luck. A perfected monarch sighed. The universe is vast. How difficult is it to find a fragment of the Tao realm? Sigh. This news was passed down from the unspeakable place. It was not only from the Xianyuan half-immortals, but also from the three pure supreme half-immortals. There was only one core. The collapse of the Xiantian Tao would cause countless fragments to scatter. Those who were able to obtain them would be able to greatly help cultivators in comprehending the direction of the Tao. It could also be said that the seeds were spreading everywhere. This was a continuation and inheritance of the Xiantian Tao. The great Tao of merit 300 years ago was like this. At that time, almost all the monks flew into the universe as long as they could fly. There were no Buddhists in the Five Rings, so the Taoists were not very interested. To the orthodox Taoists, if they obtained merit, it meant that they had to cultivate again. Moreover, it was not realistic. Without the foundation of the great Tao of merit, even if they saw a fragment of the great Tao of merit in the universe, they would be helpless and unable to fuse with it. Chapter 959. To fuse with the Tao fragments, one had to go to the void of the universe. In other words, the threshold was Yuanying. This was different from the destiny of morality 10,000 years ago. Above the Qingwei heaven, there was the Daoyuo heaven. There were 5 Bio golden immortals innate Daos, which were morality, destiny, 5 elements, time, and karma. It was the innate of the innate. When such innate Daos collapsed, they would not just stay in the void of the universe. Instead, they would penetrate everything and seep into the world. Even Shi refinement and foundation establishment cultivators, mortals, mountains, rivers, nature, and all kinds of things could be favored by the Tao. It was the Tao of Daoyuo, golden immortals. Education without discrimination, salvation for all living beings. Morality 10,000 years ago was like this. It dispersed into the mortal world, and no one knew where it ended. The destiny 1,000 years ago was the same. However, it was more direct and directly affected many people. The merit after that was no longer the Tao of Daoyuo, golden immortals. Therefore, it stopped in the universe and did not enter the Qi layer. If one wanted to pursue it, he had to go out and find it himself. It was the same for the void now. This was also the form of most of the innate Daos in the future after they collapsed. Cultivators with this Tao direction had a chance to obtain the fragments of the Tao in the universe and strengthen their own Tao state. However, there were also disadvantages. Guandu reminded, there is one thing that I have to make clear to the perfected ones. The direction of their Tao state can actually be changed. With experience, opportunities, and understanding of the universe, they will gradually find their true direction in the long time of cultivation. Just like the Crow ancestor, when he became a nascent soul, the direction of his Tao state was the 5 elements. In the end, he merged with morality. Everything is possible. However, I suspect that if a cultivator finds such a Tao fragment in the universe and fuses with it, it will be difficult for the cultivator to change the direction of his Tao in his life. Although there is not enough time to prove my idea, the Tao of heaven is full of losses. If you gain something, you will lose something. This has never changed. The perfected ones nodded. Guandu's words were very reasonable. Therefore, if a cultivator encountered such a Tao fragment, whether it was compatible or not, it would be a test of their Tao heart. Some true monarchs thought even further, and Zhou Jiong said, "Is there a possibility that after a cultivator fuses with the fragments, he can continue walking until the end of the era when he truly fuses with the innate Tao? Then, will he still be him? Or is it another form of rebirth of the previous great Tao master?" This was a heavy question, so heavy that even true monarchs like them didn't dare to think about it. What level was a Khanate Tao Lord at? The difference between them and the other party was like heaven and earth. There was at least a difference of 6 or 7 realms. If the Khanate Great Tao collapsed, what about the Golden Immortals who were the Tao Lords? Was it really dead? Or had he transformed into a myriad of fragments of the Great Tao and was ready to make a comeback at any moment? Start over after the change of the era? Countless seeds were scattered throughout the universe, and there was bound to be one that would blossom and bear fruit. Then, was this a way for innate Tao masters to avoid the calamity of the epic change? No one would remind them of these things. However, Supremes were no longer ignorant rookies in the cultivation world who didn't know the dangers of cultivation. They were familiar with the traps in the cultivation world. To some extent, they could do some unimaginable things. There was no reason that those with the highest status in the world couldn't do it. Who would be willing to cultivate to become someone else in the end? Taoist Xingshi, who had been silent all this time, spoke up. He had just returned from the deep space of the universe and had his own unique view of everything that had happened. Cultivators can't not try because of fear. Danger is the motivation for cultivators to move forward. Sticking to the rules will never lead to success. From the moment you step onto the path of Tao, danger is everywhere. What if you encounter a fortuitous encounter? What if it's a trap? Will there be repercussions after fusing with a spiritual object? What if you're controlled? Will there be a secret door in the cultivation technique that the higher-ups of the sect use? Wait, there's no such thing as safety in cultivation. Being afraid of becoming the incarnation of a Khanate Tao master after Tao integration is just groundless fear. You have to know that even if someone has the possibility of becoming a Khanate Tao master, in the process of becoming stronger, they'll be an extremely important help to Xin Yuan. Moreover, most people won't be able to reach that step at all. Even if they reach that step, a Xin Yuan that's entrusted by a Khanate Tao master is still much better than the 3 pure ones and the supreme ones, right? Therefore, there's no point in thinking about this question. If you want to merge, then merge. Then, try to go down and see when you reach that step. Guandu nodded. Senior brother Xingshi is right. Don't think about what kind of trap the Khanate Tao master has set for the lower realm cultivators. If he wants to trap you, you won't be able to escape. Therefore, the most important thing is to take all the benefits first and then think about other things later. The 3 pure ones are disdainful of Tao fragments and even spread rumors that this might be a backdoor left behind after the Khanate Tao master collapsed. A conspiracy. Actually, it's just to make others suspicious so that they can take it for themselves. Therefore, don't worry about others. If you feel that this Tao is fated with you, then go and pursue it. I actually hope that in the future, when the epic changes, there will be a dozen or so Tao masters from Xin Yuan among the 36 Khanate Taos, even if you won't be you at that time. True Lord Xiaobai laughed. A dozen or so? Senior brother, you really dare to dream. Don't look at how our 5-ring Tao master is full of talents. When the time comes, even one of them will be a great fortune. The universe's myriad realms aren't just empty words. There are many realms that don't think that the 5-ring Tao master is that far away. The 3 young gods set the tone as they chatted. This was also the style of Xin Yuan. Is it suitable for me? I'll swallow it and digest it first. If I really can't do it, I'll drag it out. This is the typical logic of bandits. If the Tao collapses, then I must fight for it. This is the right way to cultivate. A true lord passed down this message to the countless Yuanying swordsmen who were waiting at the dome. Then, after dragging it out, a few swordsmen weakly flew out of the dome and ascended into the void. Xiaobai sighed. So we were talking for nothing. There are only a few of them. I'm afraid there's a higher chance of them going out to search for the Tao Master. The great Tao, the great void, is really not fated with our sword vein. It's no wonder. If it was the Tao of slaughter and destruction, the five elements, yin and yang, look, the dome would probably be empty. The three of them were still very gratified. Although they couldn't stop the Yuanying from going into the void to try for the great void fragment, the disciples were able to remain calm in front of the great Tao. This was a sign of their firm state of mind. For example, none of the true lords present were willing to go out and try their luck. This was because they didn't think that this was their luck. Between greed and perseverance, cultivators had to make a choice. These true lords all chose to follow their hearts without exception. They didn't chase after the great Tao that collapsed. This was the reason why the Xian Yuan sword faction stood tall in the cultivation world. Chapter 960. Lu Xiaoyi traveled through the universe with Xia Bingji. They didn't go far away from Zhou Xian, but circled around Zhou Xian with an extremely large radius. This radius was even out of that part of the universe. He wasn't arrogant enough to think that he could travel freely in the universe. If he went too far, it would be very troublesome to go back. In the universe, there wasn't only one celestial phenomenon. There were countless celestial phenomena and countless opportunities. As long as you were willing to take the risk, you could always find a place where spiritual opportunity grew. The two worked hard in the universe for a full 10 years and reaped countless rewards. During this period, they killed people and were hunted down by others. The spiritual opportunity in the storage ring gradually swelled up. For Lu Xiaoyi, when he first reached Yuanying, his 1-inch nascent soul could only swallow a wisp of jade, clear spiritual opportunity every 10 days. Now, it was swallowing a wisp of jade, clear spiritual opportunity every day, just like Xia Bingji's nascent soul. However, Xia Bingji was now a 5-inch nascent soul, which could be considered as a mid-stage Yuanying. He, on the other hand, was still a little short of a 3-inch nascent soul. This was the consequence of being a nascent soul. Without the support of the Tao realm, there would always be a lack of support. He had already worked very hard in his cultivation. His cultivation talent was already terrible to begin with, and he found himself an even more troublesome 1-inch nascent soul. The J bottles are almost used up. I didn't expect to have such a big harvest this time. It's enough for me to use for a few decades. Xia Bingji's tone was filled with joy, but Lu Xiaoyi could hear the hidden meaning in her words. She wanted to go back. He had been out for nearly 40 years, and Xia Bingji had been out for even longer, a full 60 years. Although the universe was the home of cultivators, humans would never forget the feeling of being down to earth. Cultivation required balance and couldn't be so tense all the time. Just like jade, clear spiritual opportunity, one couldn't eat every day without eating. One had to eat on an empty stomach. It's time. After we finish searching this planet, I estimate that it won't take more than 10 days for us to return. Lu Xiaoyi made a decision. Xia Bingji looked at him suspiciously. If you don't cause any trouble, will you go back like this? Lu Xiaoyi was very innocent. Senior sister, from the bottom of my heart, I love peace. He hoped that the universe would be harmonious and mankind would be in good health. Killing people is self-defense. I had no choice. In the last few days, Xia Bingji obviously became lively again, which made Lu Xiaoyi sigh in his heart. This was the root of every human being. No matter how far away they were, how long they had been away, no matter how high their cultivation was, no matter how tempting the rewards were, when they heard that they were going home, they would always unconsciously reveal their emotions. He did not have such a feeling. It was as if he could float in the void and become one with the universe. Ears, come quickly. What is this? Xia Bingji's spiritual awareness came over. Lu Xiaoyi slowly walked over. Of course, he knew that it couldn't be an intruder. It could only be that she had found something new. An illusory object was wandering in a valley. Due to the special structure of the valley's walls, the object had been struggling to come out after entering, but it was still persevering. It was a massive energy, and after careful examination, the two of them determined that it was not a psionic spark. They had never heard of any other psionic spark in the universe besides the jade purity and purple purity. The energy body was very weak, but its life force was very strong. Even if it collided back and forth in the valley countless times, it did not show any signs of exhaustion. What a strange thing. I found it as soon as I entered the valley, and there were always a few strands of psionic spark chasing after it. I couldn't chase them away, and I couldn't pick them up either. They seemed to be more willing to follow this strange thing. Xia Bingji described her discovery. I have an idea. Could this thing be the fragment of the Great Path that collapsed a few years ago? Lu Xiaoyi observed for a moment and sighed. You guessed right. You shouldn't have called me, because the next scene should be two people turning against each other because of the fragment of the Great Path and fighting. The vicious swordsman snatched the treasure and the psionic spark, and then killed. Xia Bingji glared at him. Be serious. I feel that this thing is Great Void. Am I right? Lu Xiaoyi nodded, looking unfathomable. Xia Bingji suddenly reacted. You didn't see anything, did you? Are you waiting for me to explain it to you? Lu Xiaoyi was a little embarrassed. Everyone has their own specializations. I'm really having a headache with those roundabout Taoism. Taishu has never come into contact with it before, so he might be able to recognize it after some time. Why bother? Don't I have you? A few years ago, when the two were searching for psionic spark in the void, they had a premonition. This was not the first time. 300 years ago, when the merit collapsed, they felt uneasy. That was the great path of Buddhism. This time, both of them had become nascent souls, and the feeling was stronger. On the day of the collapse, there was the impact of the great path shattering. However, both of them did not cultivate in the direction of great void, so it was difficult to determine which one was collapsing. It was not like the time in the 10,000 Buddha continent, where there was a perfected cultivator to remind them. The collapse of the Great Path was not something that every cultivator could accurately grasp. Foundation establishment cultivators might feel that something was wrong, but it would pass in the blink of an eye. Jean Dan would feel uneasy for a period of time, but they did not know why. Yuan Ying's feeling was very strong, but unless their Tao state was in the direction of Great Void, it would be difficult to determine which one was collapsing from the changes in the heavenly Tao. They only knew that it was a certain Tao that belonged to Taoism, the universe. No one could investigate it, so they could only put it aside. Until she saw this energy body with Tao intent, Xia Bingji guessed that it was the great path of Great Void that was collapsing. Great Void did not belong to the 5 manifestations of the heavens, but it was widely used in Taoism. The 7 major Taoist sects of Zhou had dabbled in it. Unfortunately, Xia Bingji was not interested in it. My Tao state is in the direction of creation. I don't want to change it now. I can't keep it. Ears, why don't you try? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. Do you think it's appropriate for someone like me who plays with swords to do this? In front of an opponent, once my flying sword comes out, Great Void is coming. Things that may be precious to others are useless in the eyes of the two of them, Lu Xiaoyi suggested. Can't you find something to put away? Then bring it back to exchange for a spiritual tablet? Xia Bingji was speechless. I've heard of things like selling resources, skills, pills, and artifacts, but I've never heard of selling Daos. Can Daos be bought and sold based on weight? If a cultivator wants to take it away, he can only fuse it with his soul. It stays in the cultivator's sea of consciousness and completely fuses into one, becoming the cultivator's own thing and his own understanding. Do you think it's useless and can be taken away by putting it in a bottle? However, Lu Xiaoyi felt that it was a waste of natural resources. He did not know how many great Tao fragments like this would collapse, but he imagined that the number of immortal heavenly Tao fragments that would fall into a realm like fate was in the single digits. Great void could not possibly have more, right? It was very precious and should not be wasted. This was Lu Xiaoyi's good habit. Chapter 961. The key was how to capture, store, and carry them without fusing them. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi swindle Dao fragments again, Xia Bingji felt like she was about to collapse. I've realized that you have the potential to be a child trafficker. Forget it, you can do it yourself. I'll go over there to collect the spirit machine. If they collected more, they would be able to collect 10,000 strands of jade purity in 10 years. This was a terrifying number. Cultivators also had obsessive-compulsive disorder. They always thought that collecting 10,000 strands would be perfect. In fact, 9,000 strands was enough to make people envious. Lu Xiaoyi stared at the great void fragment, but he was thinking about something else. After forming his nascent soul this time, he had changed a lot, not only physically, but also mentally. When humans synchronize their growth process to a certain extent with the progress of the universe, one could imagine how terrifying it was. Even if he was only in a small universe at that time, the basic changes of the universe were the same. As the first living creature in the small universe, his status was similar to that of the ancestors of humans in the main world. Of course, it was not a complete comparison, but there were similarities. After forming his nascent soul for half a century, he had always been searching for the secrets of this body. He had always been discovering and pleasantly surprised. There were too many treasures in his body that needed to be unearthed. It might take a lifetime. When the small world was formed, the first life form was born. He broke himself and used the east wind to rise up. This was definitely a stroke of genius, and definitely not something that could be replicated. It required too many coincidences. A small world, a stone that had experienced the changes of the universe, coincidences in Taoism and Buddhism. It felt like stealing from the heavens. Not to mention his body, he had not figured it out yet. In the future, he would find a chance to work on his body, but not now. The main problem now was his mind, his sea of consciousness. Because there were things that he valued the most, the strength of his soul, the big bird in the sparrow palace, and the habitat of the flying sword. In the small universe's transformation of his mind, there were some miraculous changes. At that time, he was only left with a little bit of his true spirit. Through the power of the small universe, he carried out an all-round reconstruction of his body. In this process, the existing heavenly Tao was not the complete heavenly Tao, but flawed. At the very least, there were 3 innate Taos missing: morality, fate, and merit. If he formed his nascent soul 50 years later, there would be one less great void. Theoretically, it made sense because these 3 great Taos had collapsed. Morality did not matter. It seemed like he had never had that before. At the very least, he didn't care about it and didn't pay attention to it. He didn't care about merit either. His problem was fate. The ball of Qi Yuan had always accompanied him throughout his cultivation journey. It had never been separated from him, and he had encountered many fortuitous encounters in the process. Devouring was powerful, so it was natural to be colored. Fusing with the great bird of the sparrow palace, every step was a great opportunity that ordinary cultivators could only dream of. When he reached nascent soul, he had no choice but to pay special attention to the direction of his nascent soul Tao realm. Could it be fate? In theory, of course, choosing the direction where one's strength was the most rational decision. But in the end, he did not choose fate. He couldn't reason it out. It was just a vague feeling. If someone were to write a biography of him in the future, things like this could only be attributed to the author's irresponsible willfulness. He had an extremely powerful ball of providence, but he didn't have the support of the great Tao of destiny during the spirit reconstruction. This was very contradictory. Then, a variable appeared in the contradiction. His fate couldn't be eliminated because it was something that existed in the first place. There are also rules for reconstruction. You couldn't create something that didn't exist, and you couldn't make something disappear. But now, there was indeed no great Tao of destiny. Without the support of the innate great Tao, his powerful fate had become a rootless duckweed. It lacked the theoretical basis for its existence. He chose his nascent soul. So, in the end, his fate was still there. However, it wasn't the fate under the innate great Tao, but his own fate. Lu Xiaoyi had controlled his fate in his own hands. From now on, no existence could take it away. He could die, but his fate would always be his. An ordinary man couldn't seize fate. This was the portrayal of his current situation. This was a little abnormal, because in his current state, no one could see his fate anymore, because he had already broken away from the fate system under the heavenly Tao, not to mention seizing it. But from now on, he couldn't devour the fate of others, because it wasn't something in the same system. He could intercept, destroy, and eliminate the fate of others, but he couldn't take it for his own use. This strange change, in general, was more beneficial than harmful, because he no longer intentionally devoured the fate of others. Fate was a mysterious thing. It wasn't a simple accumulation of energy. The more he devoured, the better. In the future, his fate would be completely controlled by himself. The rise of his cultivation level, the change of his state of mind, the increase of his strength, the special experiences, and so on, would have nothing to do with others. His own fate, an independent fate, this suited his personality very well, even if he might wander outside the broken great Tao of destiny. Because of it, under such a premise, the Sparrow Palace in his sea of consciousness had a strange change. The Sparrow Palace was still there, the big bird was still there, but it seemed to have changed. It wasn't as elegant, beautiful, and outstanding as before. It became ordinary, and uglier. To be specific, purely from the characteristics of its body, it had a belly. Its fur had changed from rainbow to grayish-black. Its wings were no longer slender and had become short and thick. Its beak had become sharper, and its claws had become sharper. When it came out of its body, it didn't make a clear cry, but a caw-caw sound. It was just like a F***king old crow. Its eyes were no longer arrogant and cold, but had become cruel and bloodthirsty. Especially when it came out of its sword, it became blood red. It made the monstrous killing intent on his flying sword become sharper and sharper. Putting aside the ugliness, the other changes were quite in line with his wishes. It had become more like Lu Xiaoyi. The most extraordinary thing was that his flying sword, Seven Ant, wasn't reared in the old crow's belly, but had transformed into a beak. It was unknown if the old crow had transformed into the flying sword, or if the flying sword had transformed into the old crow. As its wings had become short and thick, the frequency of its vibrations had increased, and the speed of its sword had also increased. The flying sword had evolved to such an extent that it had long broken away from the form of a sword case and sword pellet. It was no longer in the form of a sword disc. It was in the form of Lu Xiaoyi. Growing together with him, there was no longer any separation. There was no need to fuse with heavenly treasures, nor was there a need to deliberately break through. Every step he took, Seven Ant would synchronize with him. The man was the sword, and the sword was the man. One with the sword, this was in line with his understanding of the swordsman. The old crow's belly was where he placed his hopes. He had a premonition that this belly could swallow any energy body with the nature of great Tao. The crux was how to get the great Tao fragment in. It wasn't that he really wanted to comprehend the great void, as he didn't have that much free time. He really wanted to use this item to exchange for a spirit tablet. It was a very simple and practical idea. Since he had nothing to do in this place, why not dig out the powers of his Sparrow Palace while collecting the great void fragment? Chapter 962. The two of them, one continuing to gather spiritual energy while the other persisting in abduction, both hoped that this trip to the universe would have a perfect ending. In fact, their 10 years of cooperation had been perfect and smooth. It was so smooth that even the heavens couldn't stand it anymore and wanted to find trouble for them. Xia Bingji was gathering spiritual energy when she suddenly received a message from Lu Xiaoyi in her mind. She sighed and gave up on gathering spiritual energy. She found a hidden place nearby and hid her body. Her aura became faint and finally disappeared completely. This was a routine that she and Lu Xiaoyi had practiced for a long time. It was the best way to deal with strange cultivators. In Ear's words, "Your face is the source of trouble." Of course, this was a joke. The advantage of this method was that Lu Xiaoyi could fight without any scruples, and she didn't have to walk between life and death. If something happened to Lu Xiaoyi in the end, she would be the last trump card. Every orthodoxy had its own specialties. For example, Xia Bingji's orthodoxy was very good at hiding. When she really used it, even Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't be able to find her unless he was very close to her. When she was escaping in the meteorite, she couldn't use this skill because she was too passive and was being chased too tightly. If she suddenly stopped breathing, even a fool would know that she must have hidden herself. But now it was different. No one knew that there were two people here. Moreover, Ear was very annoying and had a strong ability to attract hatred. There were 4 people for late Yuanying stage cultivators. In the universe, such a small team was considered quite strong. Because they didn't bring any newcomers, their actions were relatively unrestrained. The asteroid wasn't big and Lu Xiaoyi didn't deliberately hide, so they found him in a fragment of the Great Void Tao at the first moment. You Taoist, the so-called opportunity belongs to the virtuous. It doesn't matter who came first. If you get out of the way now, at least you can keep your life. The leading Taoist was very rude. It was because there were many people and also because of the general unscrupulous mood after the collapse of the Great Tao. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. In such a universal cultivation atmosphere, he had very little room for choice. The fact that the 4 of them did not mention anything about invading the universe meant that they were also outsiders of this universe. The fact that they came straight to the asteroid meant that they must have some way to track the aura of the Great Void fragment from a long distance. It wasn't that he didn't want to help others, but it was a matter of attitude. Did the current cultivation world not even have the patience to negotiate? He wanted to let Xia Bingji know that he was not a lunatic who had killed countless people. He was very reasonable. When I was young, when I played with other children, if I took a fancy to someone's toy, how would I get the chance to play with it? My mother told me that you have to be kind and polite and that you have to tell the other children your name. Which family's child was he? Would the elders of their respective clans still interact with each other? Toys won't break, and the owner might even get a few candies. In the future, they might even become friends and deal with other ignorant children together. Xia Bingji, who had concealed herself, sighed. She finally understood why this person kept getting into trouble and fighting nonstop. His mouth was really too smelly. It would have been better if he didn't say these so-called polite words, but once he did, he would definitely fight. Originally, he had the mentality of getting rid of the problem, but now he was probably going to kill him. Sure enough, one of the Taoists shouted angrily, "How dare you? Are you saying that we have no manners?" Lu Xiaoyi said slowly, "The difference between humans and animals is that humans don't act according to their instincts. Humans will consider the feelings of their own kind. You're all cultivating Tao, but you've cultivated yourself into animals?" Before he could finish, a spell had already descended, forming an illusory realm around him. Demons and devils were everywhere. It was the void realm reality that the cultivators of the Great Void orthodoxy loved to play with. Most of these demons and monsters were illusory, and only a few of them were real. However, they were formed by spells. Those who didn't know this realm and didn't have a strong would find it hard to distinguish between the illusory and real. In a battle, as long as there was a slight mistake in judgment, they would be able to find an opening and take advantage of it. Lu Xiaoyi struck out with his sword and struck the virtual image twice in a row. However, relying on his speed, he was able to narrowly avoid the real danger when it came. He was also in a very sorry state. The 4 Taoists in the sky were very disdainful. We only heard his words and didn't see his skills. We thought that he was a famous cultivator. Who knew that when he attacked? Sai, how did this person survive until now? Swordsmen are all like this. They think that they are omnipotent and can kill those who are stronger than them. That's why they don't care about cultivators in the same realm. Even a small beginner, Yuan Ying, has such an attitude. However, the only good thing about him is that his speed is not bad. I'll add another Mirage realm, and he won't be able to escape. Another Taoist cast a spell to prevent Lu Xiaoyi from escaping. Those who lived in the universe knew the principle of cutting the weeds and eliminating the roots. If the snake wasn't killed, there would be endless trouble. One day, they might be surrounded by the swordsman. Just as the Mirage realm was activated, the battle below changed again. Lu Xiaoyi was in the Mirage realm. With his mental state, how could he be confused by such a small illusion? He also had a basic understanding of the Great Void. This was the benefit of him when he formed his nascent soul. He had the most basic understanding of all the innate Taos other than the virtues and virtues. Just like when he saw the Great Void fragment, he had already understood it. It wasn't like he said that he didn't know it. He just didn't want to appear too perverted and wanted to leave some space for the woman to perform. In the Taoist Mirage realm, he was always able to escape from danger. This wasn't luck, but wisdom. However, this kind of deception couldn't last long. If he did it a few more times, it would definitely arouse suspicion. There were no fools in the universe. The reason why he did this was because he wasn't confident. He wasn't confident that he could kill all four of them. The four Taoists knew how to cut the weeds and eliminate the roots. Of course, he also knew that the principle of doing things in the universe was to not leave any loose ends. With his current strength, it wouldn't be so troublesome to deal with a late-stage Yuanying. But if there were four of them, there would be too many variables. He would have to consider their cooperation. If something went wrong, he would have to run away and leave Xia Bingji here alone. It would be very inconvenient. After cultivating for hundreds of years, he had always tried his best not to cross the boundary. He tried his best not to fight alone. If he could fight with a group, he would fight with a group. If he could fight with a group, he wouldn't fight with an adult unless he had no other choice under special circumstances. For a late-stage, nascent soul stage, cultivators were already beyond his capability. It was not like shooting targets one by one while hiding on the meteorite. Under the joint attack of the four of them, his weak cultivation base would have a fatal flaw because of the huge gap between them. It was something that could not be solved no matter how brilliant the sword arts were. Therefore, it wasn't that he had a bad mouth. It was that he had to make full use of the fact that he was still unknown in the universe. He had to make the first move when his opponents were careless. This was a tactical choice. Strategically, he didn't want to let any of them go. Whether he could fight or not depended on how many he could ambush. Chapter 963. The other Taoist was casting the mirage outside, so he was very clear about this. This was an opportunity. It was very difficult to pay attention to one's own safety while others were fighting, especially when one of his companions was attacking and the other three were watching from the sidelines. What other choice did the swordsman have other than to escape? How could he continue to provoke the three spectators? Even an idiot wouldn't do that, right? That ordinary flying sword continued to slash through the air, sweeping past the illusory demon that didn't even exist. This had already happened many times. Next, this flying sword would automatically change directions and look for its next target. The only coincidence was that the flying sword was slashing in a straight line with the Taoist casting the mirage outside. No one cared. The most crucial part of a spell cultivator's premonition of the swordsman's flying sword was when the flying sword was released. When the flying sword finished accelerating, the spell cultivator had very little time left. For a flying sword with a spirit, hitting the target was inevitable. The only difference was whether the spell cultivator's defense was perfect. Of course it wasn't, because he was casting the mirage. Therefore, when he noticed that something was wrong with the flying sword and his two senior brothers' divine sense warned him, he had already lost the last bit of time to set up his defense. His body had just swayed when the flying sword pierced through him. The explosive sword chi displayed a destructive power that was completely different from the normal flying sword itself. It flew like a slingshot but only when it hit him would he know that it was a rocket launcher. That was his last thought. Lu Xiaoyi naturally wouldn't let the Taoist who was fighting with him go. This was his original plan. If he could successfully ambush two at once, this battle would be very easy. If he could only ambush one, he would bring the other three to the depths of the universe. If he couldn't even ambush one, then he would have to run. With his current ability, he could easily split out two sword beams to attack two people. However, the Taoist in the middle of the battle was still very alert. He was not sure if he could really split out two sword beams to attack both of them. Therefore, he used his flying sword to attack the Taoist in the middle of the battle and used his old crow to attack the Taoist in the middle of the battle. The old crow was truly ferocious. Its mental power directly destroyed the opponent's sea of consciousness. It was no longer a matter of how long the opponent would take to recover, but whether the injury could be healed. What happened next was a matter of one sword strike. Before the remaining two Taoists could save him, the sword shadows filled the sky, and he began his most incisive sword strike. Xia Bingji, who was buried in the rock wall, heard such a sound. Her eardrums were filled with the shrill whistling of the sword, which was getting closer and closer, more and more frequent, and more urgent. She couldn't judge the specific situation, but it shouldn't be too bad. Otherwise, this guy would have already run away with his opponent. After being together for so long, she knew very well that once the battle started, this guy's calmness would be completely different from his usual unruly self. Then, all of a sudden, the sword whistled far away, and the surroundings returned to normal. It was obvious that the battlefield had been shifted, but it was unknown whether it was done on its own initiative or passively. Xia Bingji still couldn't control her curiosity, and she didn't think it was a good idea to continue burying herself here. If that guy really failed, it would be safest for her to leave. When she came out, what she saw were 3 floating corpses in the void. It was obvious that this guy left in the end to eliminate the source of trouble. Looking at the valley again, the spiritual vigils had already fled, and the fragment of the great void was nowhere to be seen. It must have escaped while the spiritual vigils were in disorder during the fierce battle. It didn't matter, since neither of them needed it, and neither of them could get it. The killing of a universe was magnified after the collapse of the Great Tao. There was no right or wrong in this. For cultivators who were proficient in the Great Tao of the Great Void came together to take what should have belonged to them, just because their attitude wasn't good enough. If it had to be based on right or wrong, good or evil, then that guy was the evil one, right? From the beginning, it was a deliberate massacre, and he didn't really consider settling the possible disputes peacefully. However, if it was done according to her way, what would the final result be? Would there really be a good result if she gave away the fragment of the Great Void? She didn't know. Intuition told her that if she gave away the first time, there would be a second time. If she gave away the fragment of the Great Tao, should she give away the spiritual vigils in the storage ring? Should she give away her life? Not long after, a familiar aura fluctuation came, and Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand from afar. "Let's go, senior sister." The two of them immediately made their way back, turning a blind eye to the possible spiritual vigils in the past. If they continued to gather spiritual vigils along the way, they didn't know when they would be able to return home. 2 years later, the two of them parted outside the atmosphere of Zhou, and they didn't make any plans for the future. With their combination, it wasn't suitable for them to travel together. They would be a burden to each other in battle, and they would still be a burden to each other when gathering spiritual vigils. Just like the married couple back then, they were still partners now. Lu Xiaoyi went straight back to carefree travel. After he became a nascent soul, he only returned to this so-called sect once. It was a little too dull, and this wasn't good. Everything was drifting away from the main theme, and his eyes and ears were not very sharp. His human relations were still in the Great Freedom Hall, but the person in charge was now a true lord, a genuine carefree person. His attitude could be described as carefree. It was irresponsible. Yes, after becoming a nascent soul, you need to consolidate. Consolidate, especially since your foundation is still relatively weak. After all, it's not the foundation of your cultivation technique. Now that you've consolidated your cultivation, you want to go out into the void of the universe? Let me take a look for you. Which teams are going out to gather spiritual vigils recently? I can bring you along. Great, this true lord was really muddle-headed. He thought that he was cooped up in the sect to consolidate his cultivation. After all, his 1-inch nascent soul when he first became a nascent soul was too embarrassing. No one would think that he had become a nascent soul from the ancient times. They thought that this nascent soul was very complete, somewhere between normal and abnormal. If it was another person, a cultivator with a proper carefree background, in this situation, there would definitely be elders and seniors who would ask about his well-being and find a solution together. However, he was a new follower, and one who had his own foundation in Little Lou. In the subconscious minds of most major cultivators, this kind of person couldn't be more suitable to become a complete nascent soul. Didn't he have the protection of the ancestor? Shouldn't this kind of matter be handled by the ancestor? If they acted without permission, wouldn't they be flattering the ancestor instead? As a result, very few true monarchs cared about his matters. In the past few hundred years, the number of nascent soul cultivators had doubled. There were too many troublesome matters, so who would deliberately take care of him? Martial uncle, this disciple hasn't just been cultivating in the sect all these years. I also went to the void to take a look. Lu Xiaoyi didn't tell the complete truth. There was a huge difference between looking at the void for 50 years and looking at it for a few years. The true Lord nodded. You went to the void of the universe. Yes, you did. Cultivators of our generation should be careful of the universe. The universe is your home. Only by broadening your horizons can you go further. Everything was good. Lu Xiaoyi stated his request. This disciple wants to go back to Yao Ying to take a look. That's also a carefree property, so I can't just ignore it. The true Lord said, Yao Ying is good. Body in the universe. Heart in the world. Good, good, good. Chapter 964. In the past 50 years, our shaking shadow realm has gained another 6 yuanying. Song Rong reported with a joyful expression. Lu Xiaoyi raised his eyebrows. Oh, that means there are 11 yuanying? No, that's not right. We have to count down Master Mao as well. 12. Song Rong smiled bitterly. 10. I lost 2 brothers outside. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi's inquisitive gaze, Song Rong smiled awkwardly. They were all killed in a group fight in the universe. I was there once when we fought against cultivators from other universes. We won the fight in the end, but the losses were unavoidable. There was nothing we could do about it. Lu Xiaoyi was just asking casually. He didn't think about how he could help them settle the matter. The universe was so big, and the future was so long. It was impossible to settle it all. This was a big stage, and the change of the era was imminent. Those who couldn't keep up were destined to be eliminated. I have some new insights. I can't guarantee that I'll be right when I reach the nascent soul realm. The only thing I can say is that I've walked this path without any mistakes. Call them all over. I'll teach you all a lesson. Lu Xiaoyi was full of confidence for this lesson. This was because his flying sword system had finally taken shape after 700 years of cultivation. Now that the flying sword system was set, everything else had a standard. He didn't have to constantly search for it like before. This was what he wanted to instill in his swordsman subordinates. Nothing was certain. Learning to deny oneself was a good habit. Being complacent in the current environment would only lead to elimination. His path might not necessarily be the path of others, but there was more than one path to the upper realm. As long as they put in the effort and dared to try, they would eventually find a path that belonged to them. However, the swordsmen were more concerned about this time. Che Xie asked the question that everyone wanted to know. About the collapse of the Tao. Does the sword master have anything to remind us? Lu Xiaoyi nodded. This had to be explained clearly. Otherwise, who knew what these daring fellows would do? There are a few things that I'm certain of. Actually, you already know. First, the collapse of the Great Tao was a trend, but the timing was uncertain. It might speed up, or it might take a longer time. But with the universe's heavenly Tao's endurance, It is impossible for the 30 or so innate Taos to collapse at the same time. Thus, it will take a longer time, so long that there is no need for you to think about it now. A few thousand years is the minimum. Are you sure you can live until then? The swordsman laughed. Nandang pondered and said, Sword Master, are you saying that we don't have to think too much about the changes in the future? Regardless of whether the great Tao will collapse or not, we should choose the one that suits us. We don't have to think about which great Tao will collapse in the end and deliberately choose it. Lu Xiaoyi pointed at him and said, Nandang, you stepped on my heel and got some of my spiritual energy. That's right. If the Tao realm you chose when you formed your nascent soul was the one that collapsed in the end, then congratulations. Your cultivation strength and swordsmanship will be stronger because of the great Tao. If you choose the Tao realm and it collapses, or if you choose a Tao realm that has already collapsed, it's not a big deal. Once it disintegrated, it would recombine. All of you have the experience of going through this process in advance. This is to build a foundation for you to attempt the unification of the Tao in the future. The collapse of the great Tao doesn't mean that it's gone. It's just that it's not systematic and there's no clear structure. There's no standard. But this also means that the direction you're heading in might be the correct one. These words made the swordsman very excited. Who didn't want to unify the Tao in cultivation, even if the chances were slim? From what I know, in the 9 great sects, there are many cultivators who choose the Tao realm that has already collapsed. I won't say which is right and which is wrong, because they all have their reasons. You just have to follow your heart. Don't be deliberate. This is the essence of cultivation. Let nature take its course. You will never be wrong. Looking at the crowd, there were Yuanying and Jindan cultivators. There were hundreds of them. The shaking shadow realm was really flourishing now. It was also a good time. Whether it was Yuanying, Jindan, or Foundation Establishment, the upper level was much easier than it was a few hundred years ago, and it was foreseeable that it would be even easier in the future. Secondly, when the great Tao collapses, there will be fragments floating in the void of the universe. Those who are strong will obtain them. This is not a rumor. This may not be good news for the Jindan cultivators, but you all have a chance. If the Tao of Zenith Heaven collapses, it will be like the fate of morality, spreading to the mortal world. Maybe you can sleep for a while, and the great Tao will come to you? The swordsman laughed. If the great Tao of the 5 elements and time collapsed, it would be the beginning of a new era, right? When the end of the world came, how many people would be able to see it? At the very least, they would have to reach the level of young, God-perfected Lord. Who could guarantee that they would be able to do it? Lu Xiaoyi laughed. So, this is actually still a mess. Just like the previous collapse of merit. This time, the Great Void, which of you can unify the fragments of the Great Tao? The Yuanying cultivators' side. None of them were in the direction of the Great Void. Even if they went to the void of the universe, it would be useless. Could they find it? Even if they found it, they couldn't unify it. It was meaningless. Just as the Sword Master said, there was no difference between knowing too much and not knowing at all. Those who did not have a strong will and liked to think about other things would be better off not knowing. It would be a waste of time. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Chaos is coming. What should we do? Predict? I'm sorry, but I'm afraid your guess is not even close. Make plans? It's a pity that plans can't change so quickly. Even a perfected Lord may not be able to design the most correct path for himself, let alone us Yuanying and Jindan cultivators. So my suggestion is to do what is within the scope of your abilities. Lu Xiaoyi's expression was serious. First, set a small goal for yourself. Jindan, think about how to become a nascent soul. If you can't do it in such a big environment, wouldn't you be too useless? Yuanying, live for 100 years first. The void of the universe is not peaceful now. Survival is the way of the king. In this chaotic world, strength is the most important thing. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Cultivation is like climbing a tower. If you're on the first level, just think about the second. If you insist on thinking about the peaches of immortality at the top level, it's not wise. Work hard to improve your cultivation and swordsmanship. Protect your home and help your brothers. This is what you can do now. Do it. If you keep doing it, you will realize that your goal might be closer to you. He stood up. The sword vein is a whole. How to survive in the cracks of Buddhism is what we should consider. As for the change of era, leave it to the taller people to shoulder. Lu Xiaoyi walked out of the hall, leaving the group deep in thought. He had said what he needed to say. He was also doing what was within the scope of his abilities, but he would not add more burdens to himself. Actually, he was not only talking about these swordsman brothers, but also himself. Although he had become a nascent soul, the changes at the top level were still too far away from him. It had nothing to do with him. Chapter 965. Taoist Master Mao was waiting for him outside with a hint of sadness in his gratification. It seems like I don't need to remind you of certain things. That's good. Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. I know my limits. Senior, I think you, Taoist Master Mao said indifferently. I've been with you for almost 100 years in Shaking Shadow. I've already forgotten what the universe is like. Shaking Shadow doesn't lack yuanying anymore. That's why I'm here to ask for leave. I'm going to take a trip to the universe, and I don't know when I'll be back. I'm relieved to leave Shaking Shadow to you. You're doing better than us. Lu Xiaoyi was very sharp. Senior is true monarch E and the others. Taoist Master Mao didn't care. This is a matter of the older generation. It has nothing to do with you. We have our history, and you have your responsibilities. Don't get involved. It's not good for either of us. There's no right or wrong in cultivation. Once you're in a whirlpool, you can't control yourself. This isn't fake nobility. You can't help us with our problems. We can't help you with Shaking Shadow's future either. Everyone should do what they should do. This is cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi bowed deeply. He really couldn't help with these matters. Taoist Master Mao left. He didn't even say where he was going. Lu Xiaoyi came to Shaking Shadow's sword transport hall. The brightest lanterns had already been extinguished. They belonged to true monarch E and the other yuanying sages. He sighed. He had only met true monarch E a few times. After entrusting Shaking Shadow to him, they hadn't met again. True monarch E's determination made him sigh. Not to mention his strength, just his state of mind was enough to make him a real swordsman. He knew that he couldn't let his emotions fluctuate. Some things were better remembered. This was the cultivation world. It wasn't a place where he could get angry. At the very least, he couldn't afford to do that now. Not only could he not do that, but even the swordsmen under him couldn't do that either. If you jump forward, there's a hole waiting for you below. Shaking Shadow was still accumulating power. There were a few characters in yuanying that Lu Xiaoyi had high hopes for. Zhou Fan, Song Rong, and a few others had already begun to take a step that was unique to them after 100 years of training. It wasn't Xiaoying's, nor was it Lu Xiaoyi's. Instead, it was a unique path that they had forged with their own conditions. This was also the hope that Lu Xiaoyi had for them. Building a comprehensive system could not be done by just one person, not even him. He had stayed in the shadow-shaking realm for over a year, discussing the true essence of swordsmanship with the swordsman without holding anything back. While teaching others, he was also improving himself. This was Lu Xiaoyi's method. It is also a process that every founder of a system had to go through. A single tree couldn't make a forest. After all, a person's thoughts were limited. When many people picked up firewood, the flames would grow. What made him happy was the current cultivation atmosphere in the shadow-shaking realm. Here, there were no masters and disciples, only brothers. Everyone could freely express their own thoughts. Under Lu Xiaoyi's core principles, they complemented each other. All kinds of ideas were unconstrained, and a system was slowly taking shape. Right now, it was still a small sapling, but in the future, it would definitely grow into a towering tree. This kind of swordsmanship atmosphere would only appear in the early stages of a system. A few people, some close friends, all for the sake of a common goal. When the shadow-shaking realm was fully matured and the internal rules began to change to a strict system, this kind of atmosphere would slowly disappear. This process was unavoidable. Creativity would be steadily replaced. Seniority, age, and so on. Just like when the universe was first formed, all kinds of changes were eternal. You couldn't say which was good and which was bad. It was just like how you could never compare the frivolity of youth with the steadiness of old age. This was a process that had to be experienced at every stage. He was very happy that he was fortunate enough to lead this process. Izu. Lu Xiaoyi laughed foolishly. A year later, he appeared on the land of Taishan Zhongwang. He was here to look for Qing Xian. After going through a lot, the relationship between the few people with the same face had been spread out. There were coincidences and schemes. With snot and rabbit crack lip, this small circle seemed very natural. No one would know that the two of them were the ones who were really close to each other. Daoist governor respectfully led him into the Taishan Mountain Gate. In the eyes of these Jin Dan Daoists, they were already legendary figures whose fame had spread far and wide. Among the huge body cultivators, they could barely be regarded as little ancestors, so they didn't dare to slight them. Uncle Master Quansu has a problem and can't welcome you personally. I hope Uncle Master Dan can forgive me. Daoist governor apologized. Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand. You don't need to cover for him. How can he be unwell at his level? He was beaten up, wasn't he? How embarrassing. But it doesn't matter. As long as I'm here, I'll get him back. The Daoist governor smiled awkwardly. If anyone else had said this, he would have been displeased. But these four people were friends and strong, so he could only treat these disgusting words as the concern between friends. Qing Xian's abode was on an independent mountain peak. The environment was elegant, and the scenery was enchanting. Lu Xiaoyi pursed his lips. If Daoist three purities were like this, then they could make do with anything but the abode's environment. Quansu, are you dead yet? I brought you a coffin. I guarantee you'll like it. Daoist governor left quietly, smiling wryly. But in his heart, he was envious. To be able to have such a friend at the Yuanying level was rare, even if it was a bit vulgar. A humph could be heard from within the abode, but no one refused to welcome him. This was in line with Qing Xian's usual attitude. Truth be told, in his current state, the last thing he wanted to see was someone taking pleasure in his misfortune. Lu Xiaoyi barged into the abode. As he expected, it was clean and tidy, without a speck of dust. The decorations were exquisite, and the atmosphere was natural and elegant. The incense in the cauldron was as faint as smoke. He had to admit that this was a place for cultivators. In comparison, Lu Xiaoyi's abode was a pigsty. Qing Xian straightened his body and sat cross-legged on the Daoist couch in the middle of the room. His expression was normal, his breathing was calm, and his eyes were clear. He just looked at him quietly, not saying a word. Lu Xiaoyi frowned. Stop pretending. We've known each other for hundreds of years. Who doesn't know each other? If you keep pretending, I'll just kill you with my sword. That'll be the end of my grudge with the three purities. Qing Xian's anger surged, but he suppressed it. In front of this guy, some things cannot be hidden. Lu Xiaoyi walked around the room as if he was familiar with the place. He took out a pot of wine from a hidden place and poured himself a cup. He was very curious. I say, Daoist, this shouldn't be. With your skills, even if you were to compete with others in the universe, you wouldn't end up like this. Do you think I don't know the three purities? If you can't beat them, you run. If you can't outrun them, you cower. If you can't cower, you'll use underhanded methods. Qing Xian really couldn't stand his chatter. Sugar-coated haws. Don't be so sarcastic. As cultivators, victory and defeat are common. What's so hard to say? A few years ago, when I met that slug, he even said that you were beaten up like a dead dog by a monk in the core of the Sea of Stars. I won't go and make sarcastic remarks. Chapter 966. You're really magnanimous. Don't make sarcastic remarks now. I'll admire you. Lu Xiaoyi pursed his lips. This slug, he can't hide any secrets. I'll seal his mouth sooner or later. He observed Qing Xian carefully and chuckled. Ox knows, why do I feel like you were also beaten up by a monk? I was beaten up by a monk at the core of the Sea of Stars. At that time, I was still a Jindan. It's not embarrassing to be beaten up by Mahabodhisattva. And in the end, I still killed him. What about you? Tell me, who's who among us brothers? How dare he beat up my brother? I'll teach him a lesson. Qing Xian was speechless as he watched this guy pretend to be a big brother. Cultivators were very sensitive to their own strength, including themselves and others. He had to admit that along the way, when he embarked on the foreign journey in the land of exile, he at least had a psychological advantage. However, under the various complications of Zhou Xian's upper realm, he knew that he was left behind by another step every time he met this guy. When he killed Big Eyes and Small Eyes at the Taipu realm, he already knew that he was behind this person. This was also a principle that he understood from the moment he met this person. The more time he was given, the harder it would be to deal with this guy. He was one step ahead of him in the Yuanying. He thought that he finally gained an advantage, but now that he saw the person in person, it made him very depressed. This swordsman was different from before. He could not pinpoint the specific differences, but it was definitely not just because of his nascent soul. There was something deeper. This person was not suitable to be friends with. He would make people feel despair. It's Buddhism. However, it's not the origin of Zhou Xian. It's a pure Buddhism domain in another universe. You were beaten up by a group of people. Lu Xiaoyi liked to dig up old scores and expose scars, especially this Qing Xian. However, Qing Xian's answer was unexpected. It wasn't a group fight. It was just one person. We fought one-on-one. I lost. It's that simple. The joke was over, Lu Xiaoyi said seriously. One person? There's such a person in the nearby universe? A Mahabodhisattva for many years? You can't win in terms of cultivation? Qing Xian shook his head again. Not entirely. He was just a little earlier than you and I, and he's also a newcomer. If it's Mahabodhisattva, I know my own weight and won't fight head-on. This person should have fused with the great path of merit fragment. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. That makes sense. But I'm curious. Is the assistance of those Grand Dao fragments really that great? It can make people reborn? Qing Xian smiled bitterly. All in all, she has great strength. She became a bodhisattva before her merit collapsed. It was not as easy as it is now, so she had talent and strength. Her merit collapsed more than 100 years ago, so she had more than 100 years to comprehend. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. You can't underestimate the heroes of the world. What domain was it? What's his name? Qing Xian was very vigilant. Calabash, this is my business. I have to get up from where I fell. Are you trying to disturb my mental state by interfering? Lu Xiaoyi smiled and said, Who would have the patience to come all the way to avenge you? But I have to know the general idea. I can't just bump into him and not know who he is. Qing Xian sneered. Don't think I don't know. Your purpose is to find out who it is so that you can launch a sneak attack. It's Yihang Bodhisattva from the Siam domain. It's a rare domain where Buddhism thrives. I don't know much about the rest. Lu Xiaoyi pondered and said, Do you think that your encounter with him was arranged by someone? Qing Xian understood what he meant. I'm not sure. Everything happened naturally. You also know that the universe is very chaotic now. I can't confirm the relationship between Siam and Zhou Xian, the two major Buddhist sects in the upper realm. The reason why I went to that domain was to verify it. What do you want to verify? Lu Xiaoyi asked. Qing Xian snorted and said, We all know that Buddhism played a very important role in the transmission of fate in the azure sky. However, Taoism's role seems to be very uncertain. It's very contradictory. So after I formed my nascent soul, I consciously headed to the nearby universes in an attempt to get close to those domains where Buddhism thrives. I hope to find something from them. Unfortunately, the monks seem to be very cautious about this, and the average bodhisattvas don't know much about it. Over the years, I've been to Siam, Lumbini, Lui, and Lingjue. It's very difficult to infiltrate, and there's no hope of communicating with them. But since I'm looking for Spiritium, I might as well follow the paths of these Buddhist realms. What's awkward is that I didn't find anything, but I did find a lot of Spiritium. I'm speechless. Lu Xiaoyi sighed inwardly. He wasn't as persistent as Taoist three purities when it came to missions. Perhaps it was because they had different methods of doing things. Qing Xian followed the prescribed order step by step, never stopping. But he always wanted to stand out from the crowd and take the unconventional path. But he still felt the need to remind his companion, I think it's impossible to rely on scouting, especially when it comes to the upper echelons of Buddhism. It's also unrealistic to make friends with them. If we make friends with them, they won't know anything. If we make friends with them, they'll be on their guard. It could be a trap. After all these years, we haven't even figured out what the upper echelons of Taoism are doing. So how can we talk about Buddhism? I don't care where you go to gather spiritium, but if you keep wandering around Buddhism's domain, you'll eventually run into ghosts at night. Qing Xian asked, what do you mean? Lu Xiaoyi said firmly, we still have to walk the path of Taoism. This is the only path we can take. I don't believe that as one of the most powerful forces in the universe, the Taoist forces here don't know anything about Buddhism's true movements. Impossible. They must know. It's just that our current level is still one level away from this circle. If you have the time to waste in the universe, not to mention the high risk, you won't get anything out of it. You might as well cultivate the sect. At the very least, we're nascent soul cultivators now and have more contact with the perfected monarchs of the sections. There's bound to be opportunities. With their level of observation over a long period of time, the general trend of Buddhism can't be wrong. Qing Xian was silent for a while and finally nodded. He had attained nascent soul a few decades earlier than Lu Xiaoyi. In the past 100 years, he had been wandering in the universe and repeatedly came close to Buddhism's domain. Needless to say, it was thrilling. But what annoyed him was that after spending so much effort, there was no progress in scouting. This made him start to doubt his own strategy. After working hard for more than 100 years, he was somewhat unwilling to give up. It was difficult for him to walk out of this psychological circle. Today, with Lu Xiaoyi's advice, he was completely awakened. This was the advantage of having companions. They could look at the problem from another perspective and not walk the same path to the end. But there were mistakes. At least in the past 100 years of experience in the universe, there was no lack of spiritual opportunity. Finally, he did not neglect his cultivation. Chapter 9:67. We seem to have entered a misunderstanding. Lu Xiaoyi pondered and said, we naturally think that the two Buddhist sects in the upper realm of Zhou are the masterminds behind the scenes, just like how we thought that Taoism played a decisive role when we first came here. But what if it's not? What if it's someone else? Or maybe it's a joint action plan of Buddhist sects in many universes, and the two Buddhist sects in Zhou are just two of the more important ones? Qing Xian said coldly, to investigate the core secrets of the upper echelons. In normal times, we might not be able to know all of them, even if we become perfected lords. But now, the biggest event in the cultivation world is the change of era. As long as we perform well in our respective sects, it's not impossible for us to come into contact with these second-tier secrets. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Let's try our best. What I'm worried about is that in the end, these two things will combine into one. Then the cultivation world will be lively. Qing Xian was stunned and said dejectedly, you jinx. The possibility of this is very high. The two of them were speechless. He couldn't give any constructive advice about Qing Xian's injuries because the way he recovered from his injuries couldn't be replicated. As for the conventional methods, no one was better than Taoism, especially Taishuan's yellow in the middle, who had the roots of the three pure ones. In terms of how to heal himself, he was miles ahead of Lu Xiaoyi. It's a pity that Yu can't mix in. His cultivation is not good enough. And Buddhism is the most sensitive to this kind of evil existence. Not to mention the level of Buddha, he can't even pass the level of Bodhisattva. Oh right, I haven't seen this guy for a long time. Have you seen him recently? Qing Xian thought for a while. I saw him about 30 years ago. To be precise, he came to me and asked about your situation. After knowing that we've all become nascent souls, he was a little anxious and said that we don't have to look for him for the time being. He wants to find a way to go to the upper realm while the heavenly axiom is weak now. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. I don't understand how an existence like him can go to the upper realm. Qing Xian sneered. Cats have their own cat ways. Mice have their own rat ways. Humans have their own human ways. And spirits have their own soul ways. Of course, they have their own ways. This guy hasn't been idle all these years. He's not as indifferent as he looks. After thinking for a while, he opened his mouth. Calabash, there's something I don't know if I should say. Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. Tell me, is it about this Yu-Hu? Do you think there's something fishy about this guy? Not as frank and straightforward as you appear to be? Qing Xian nodded. She was not surprised at all. With this swordsman's experience, it would be hard to fool him. It was hard to imagine how someone like him could master swordsmanship. For a soul body like Yu-Hu, the reason it can exist is because of its tenacity. Ordinary people couldn't compare to the toughness of their soul and spirit. To be able to be subdued so effortlessly by the two of us, how can existence who could rely on their mental strength to hold on have such weak willpower? How did he get to the heaven and earth chessboard? He had been vague all this time. I can't think of any other way to escape, especially in front of the sun god. It doesn't make sense that the two of us have to risk our lives to fight for a way out, but he can stay out of the three of us? After yuaning, I've become more sensitive to this kind of soul body. Maybe it's because of the uniqueness of the three pure ones' inheritance, but the Taoist inheritance here isn't bad either. Why did several perfected lords turn a blind eye to him when he came out? All these years, although you and I have had our ups and downs, on the whole, we've never been in real danger of our identities. When we were unknown, it was pardonable. No one paid attention to too small Jean Dan. But when we stood on the stage of Jean Dan and stood in the limelight, no one paid attention to our origins. Don't you think it's strange? Lu Xiaoyi sighed. I know what you mean. You don't doubt its sincerity when we first met, but you suspect that after it returned to Zhou Xian, everything about it might have been controlled, or maybe it's in a state of limited freedom under surveillance. Qing Xian made a judgment. I think it was discovered as soon as it entered Zhou Xian. Then, when the two of us were pulled into the chessboard of life and death, Yu Gu was singled out. There are two ways we can't judge. Was it directly spat out, or was it unknowingly peeked at? It seems that we didn't reveal our sex in the crack back then, did we? Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. Does it matter if it's spat out or not? If they can send people to the land of exile, how can they not know about the blue sky great world? If they know about the blue sky great world, how can they not know about the five rings? Who plays with sword in the blue sky, five rings? Other than Xin Yuan, who else? Who plays with swords? The three pure ones are supreme. Do you have any hidden treasures? So whether Yu Gu knows or not, and whether he spits it out or not, I'm afraid we can't hide our details. Personally, I think that his memory must have been unknowingly peeked at. The Yang spirit method wouldn't leave behind any evidence to make Yu Gu panic. It wouldn't be difficult for them to directly use the secret technique to search his soul, right? Then they would let Yu Gu go and let the three of us work together. This is the trick that you Taoists like to play the most. Cast a long line to catch a big fish, and then use it at a critical moment. Do you dare say that the three pure ones don't do this when they encounter such a thing? Qing Xian glared at him. You speak as if Xin Yuan is so innocent. It's not terrible that a swindler cheats, but it's terrible that a bandit cheats too. The question now is, why do they do this? What's their purpose? Will they pull in the net? Is there any other conspiracy? Has our secret spread? Or is it limited to the highest level? Anyway, I only know one thing. That white-browed guy from Xiaoyao Travel will never forget the two of us. Both of them were thinking hard. These changes couldn't be felt when they were still Jean Dan. That was the difference in all aspects. Especially for this kind of Yang spirit level scheme, it was impossible to have the opportunity to be hit by a whim. However, the two of them had reached the nascent soul stage one after another, and their abilities had improved greatly in all aspects, especially in the aspect of mystery. The monarch could no longer suppress and deceive them absolutely. It was natural for them to realize where the problem was. After Lu Xiaoyi reached the nascent soul stage, he basically didn't dare to stay in Shaoya Mountain. Qing Xian went to search for the secrets of Buddhism, but they were all floating in the universe. In fact, it was the same principle. They hadn't figured out how to deal with this fact. I think it's better for us to keep pretending like this, unless they take the initiative to reveal it. Lu Xiaoyi said word by word. He had already thought it through. It was impossible for them to run away. This was not in line with their character. It was also a complete denial of their 200 years. They could only continue to stay and look for a trace of opportunity in this ambiguity. Qing Xin agreed. It makes sense. Since they already know our origins, why do they still open the door for us everywhere? As for me, I haven't encountered any obstacles in Taixin all these years. It's as if there's always a pair of hands supporting me from behind. Vaguely, faintly discernible. It's the same for you. You even have the opportunity to lead a continent alone. Xiaoyao really treats you well. So, what's the point of them doing this? In theory, the best way to deal with it is to be ordinary and ignore it, right? Chapter 968. Lu Xiaoyi smiled brightly. Have you ever considered, what if they also want something from us? This is the simplest and most normal reasoning. Don't make things so complicated. In fact, the so-called cultivation world is nothing more than using each other. We have some value that they want to use us for. Qing Xin immediately understood. You're saying that they want to use the sect behind us? Or the power of the fifth ring? Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. Why not? Is the power of the fifth ring something that the cultivation world of the universe can ignore? In a universe, even though the celestial Zhou upper realm is much bigger, we all know that it is not difficult to destroy the celestial Zhou upper realm. Of course, they won't see it that way. At most, they'll think that the fifth ring is on the same level as Zhou Xian. This is where our value lies. If we're not good enough and can't affect the fifth ring, they can at least get 2 cultivators. If we can move the power behind us, it's a profit for them. They just have to pay some resources and techniques. We can't spread it out. It's a good deal, we won't lose out. Qing Xin's eyes lit up. The most important thing is that they have a reason to do this. The threat of the Buddhists. These old Taoists might have seen through some of the Buddhists' unsettling actions. They pretended to cooperate while secretly colluding with their opponents, inviting wolves into the house. The 2 of us are the wolves. The future changes will depend on how much influence we can exert. If the Buddhists win in the end, Zhou Xian and the other Taoists will be the victors. They're allies, so it's Zhou Xian's victory. If we win at the fifth ring, Zhou Xian's Taoists will still be the victors. This is a victory for the orthodoxy. It's a win-win situation. Brilliant, truly brilliant. 2 cobblers had put together a zhuge. Perhaps it was not comprehensive, and there were still some discrepancies in the details, but the 2 of them were the most outstanding golden core cultivators at the 5-ring level back then. Now, they were also the most outstanding nascent soul cultivators in Zhou Xian. Their sensitivity, perception, and intuition were all extraordinary. There shouldn't be any mistakes. Why can't they just leak the Buddhist plans to us and then send us back? Bring some local specialties or something. Lu Xiaoyi joked. Qing Xin knew that he was joking, but it was more like he was explaining to her. With the entanglement of the heavenly Tao, how can many things be said clearly? The higher a cultivator's realm was, the more mysterious they would be, beating around the bush. He would never leave any trace for the heavenly Tao to blame. Especially now, before the change of the era, everyone would wipe their buttocks clean. They even had to put some perfume on their buttocks. Therefore, we must find the truth ourselves. Take the blame yourself. The 2 of them looked at each other speechlessly. They were the ones who barged in, so they couldn't blame others for taking the blame. This kind of thing was a tacit understanding. They had a tacit understanding to wait for time and slowly understand the truth. Then, when the truth was revealed, the mystery would be revealed. What's the point of going back now? If the Buddhists didn't do anything, what could a 5-ring cultivator do? This was the plan of the young gods of the Taoist school of Zhou Xian. They did not stop it, did not support it, and did not keep it a secret. Let the situation develop, and then make their choice at the last moment. But on both sides, Lu Xiaoyi stood up. So, it's unnecessary for you to go to the Buddhist domain. What's the hurry? I understand now. I won't ask around in the future and will focus on cultivation. When I reach that level, I won't need you to listen. Naturally, there will be people who will pass on the information you want to hear through various means. Being a spy is the same as being a master. Seeing him walk out, Qing Xin shouted from behind, "Calabash, I don't care what you do. But don't go too far with that sword vein you made yourself. I know what you Xinyuan people are like. No matter where you go, you'll raise a flag and rebel. And you call it equality in the name of Tao orthodoxy. Let me tell you, you have to know your priorities. Don't use your sword vein to affect the big picture." Lu Xiaoyi didn't even turn his head. To me, the sword vein is the big picture. Others? I don't care if they die. Their conversation with Qin Xian had established a psychological foundation for the two of them. Otherwise, the various matters of the Buddhist sect would be like a boulder pressing down on them, without a moment of peace. Actually, if you think about it more broadly, it's just a game, a stage. Everyone has to play their roles conscientiously on the stage. Don't overstep the rules. Don't overstep the bounds. When the time comes, you'll definitely know what you need to know. Even if you don't want to know, you can't. As for who among the upper echelons knew their secret, it wasn't important. His guess was that it was limited to the small circle of Yang spirit, because it wasn't time yet. After leaving Taixin, he had nowhere to go and nothing to do. He used to be as tired as a dog when he was in Jindan, but now that he had some free time, he was actually a bit bored. Yaoing had already made the arrangements, and Huang Ting didn't have any other thoughts. He was too lazy to go to the clear immortal sect, and he wasn't interested in other places. It wasn't easy to fight either, so he felt uncomfortable all over. He could only return to carefree travel. Since he had thought everything through, he didn't feel any pressure when he met the people of carefree travel. He couldn't be any more natural, as if he had always been a member of carefree travel. When he returned to his pigsty, he couldn't compare to Taoist three purities, but he didn't care. There were two things he wanted to do when he returned to carefree travel. The first was to sort out the techniques and sword techniques of Carefree Mountain's Yuan-ing period and pick out some that he could use. He definitely wouldn't be able to use any techniques. He didn't lack any fundamental techniques. The Big Dipper scripture, the Constellation Treasure Mirror, the 5-element shift, and the Heavenly Heart stratagem were enough to keep him busy. There was no need for him to add any more. When it came to techniques, the more one cultivated them, the more one would feel that they all originated from the same source. The best method was to stick to one and supplement it with several. In this regard, he chose to trust in Xuanyuan's inner sword. Sword techniques. He needed to broaden his horizons. In truth, he couldn't directly use any of the sword techniques in his hand right now. He needed to change the style. Thus, what he meant by study was actually to observe the essence, thoughts, and concepts of the sword techniques. If he felt that they were good, he would think of a way to change them and incorporate them into his own system of sword techniques. Subsidies. This was something that he valued greatly. It would help him to use these small tricks in battle to achieve his goals. For example, how to use Taoist techniques to break through the barriers of the Buddha world, how to avoid being caught by Buddhist barriers, and how to avoid being contaminated by that annoying Buddhist energy when being attacked by Buddhist arts. Wait a minute. There were dozens of Xiantian Daos in this world, and countless Hotian Daos. No one could become proficient in every single one of them, but one had to focus on the main areas. Right now, his main focus was on how to deal with Buddhist disciples. In this regard, the hundreds of thousands of years of Taoist experience was of utmost importance. It was much more comprehensive than if he were to stupidly think about it alone. Chapter 969. Secondly, he needed to settle down and study the uninvited guest in his Sparrow Palace, the fragment of the Great Void Tao. Yes, the Great Void fragment didn't disappear on its own. It was Lu Xiaoyi who captured it. Lu Xiaoyi, who had tried many different methods in the past, had no success in luring and deceiving. When the battle was fierce and he would rather destroy this fragment of the great Tao than leave it to the enemy. He had taken a rash approach and directly slashed with the flying sword. Reality proved that the rules couldn't be cut. Therefore, he used the sparrow god to wrap it up and succeeded. This thing was amenable to force, but not persuasion. Was there a great Tao that refused a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit? When the battle ended and he came back to his senses, he observed the thing in his sparrow palace again and realized that his so-called success was just capturing it and not merging it. Of course, he didn't want to merge it. He wasn't familiar with the Great Void, and there was no need to work on it. There was only one way for a cultivator to get a fragment of the connate Tao, and that was to merge it. If you had comprehended the Great Void and were suitable for this great Tao, you could use the Tao fusing fragment to take it away. Or rather, it couldn't be said to be taken away. Instead, it became a part of the Great Void's rules in the cultivator's sea of consciousness. Lu Xiaoyi really took it away. He couldn't merge it and wasn't willing to merge it. Therefore, the Great Void fragment existed in his sparrow palace in an independent way, just like a guest. Up until now, 4 great Taos had collapsed. There were some thought-provoking differences among them, such as morality and destiny. That was the great Tao of Zenith Heaven, a great Tao that everyone had and could be compatible with. It was a great Tao that even mortals could accept because as long as one was a human, they would definitely have some morality and some destiny. Because they were supremes, they were not picky about their audience. Thinking about it this way, when the 5 elements, time and cause and effect, great Taos collapsed, they should also descend to the world and the mortal world. The other connate Taos didn't work because they chose people. Not only did they choose the realm, but they also chose the direction of the cultivator's Tao. If you didn't cultivate the Great Void Tao, why would the fragment choose you? It was the same for merits. Why was Lu Xiaoyi able to capture it? He thought about it for a long time and slowly figured out the problem. That was because his sparrow god's sea of consciousness was in the form of a small universe. This was decided by the power of the small world when he recast it. Perhaps this thing didn't feel too much rejection here, because when the small universe was formed, it contained the residual power of 30 innate Taos. That should be it. However, even if the Great Void Fragment didn't reject it, the Great Tao didn't reject it, the owner of the Great Tao didn't intend to let the Great Tao. Therefore, it was a guest. That was the Great Void Tao, the Tao to the Taos to the Tao, the Tao, the Tao to the Tao, the Tao, the Tao, the Tao to the Tao, the Tao. He it. But what made him vexed was that he had tried all along the way, but this evil tenant was stingy. Doubt. Tao to the Tao. If you refuse a toast, then you'll have to drink a forfeit. Since it was in the Sparrow Palace, using the 7-ant sword spirit to bully, it was very suitable. This tenant was very arrogant. He even fought back. Of course, this was a battle at the Tao realm level. 7-ant invasion was like fire. The fragment would rather die than submit. Such a scene happened every day, and it had already become a daily occurrence. It was also during this routine that Lu Xiaoyi learned how to deal with the Great Void Tao. The fragment's Tao intent was extremely profound, but it wasn't as cunning as a human. While it was fiercely defending its own Tao intent, it also revealed its Tao intent completely. Lu Xiaoyi was thinking that using this method to familiarize himself with different Tao realms was also a good way. In the future, if other great Taos collapsed, he could find the fragments and come here. He could familiarize himself with the purest great Tao concept for free. What could be more suitable than this? In the Carefree Mountain sect, he could deal with these troubles without worrying about being disturbed. This was a completely different concept compared to being in the universe with a string stretched taut all the time. He also needed some time to relax. At the same time, he could interact with the perfected and perfected cultivators of the Carefree Mountain sect. At the very least, he had to get familiar with them, right? The Carefree Mountain sect didn't have many perfected masters and perfected monarchs. Like other Taoist sects, when the Great Void Tao collapsed and the fragments scattered across the universe, it was time for them to set off. The Great Void Tao wasn't suitable for swordsmen, but it was very suitable for orthodox Taoists. It was so suitable that many Tao realm cultivators who were in the Great Void Tao realm rushed into the universe to search for their opportunities. Very few Great Void Tao realm cultivators would travel together in this search. If they really found it, whose opportunity would it be? They were all brothers and sisters. There was no balance. Therefore, usually a Great Void Tao realm cultivator would find a few other Great Void Tao realm cultivators and explore the universe together. Under this kind of dragging, almost all the experts in the Yuanning perfected monarchs were dragged away. Perfected Master Jia was troubled. There were two perfected masters in the carefree travel sect. One was perfected Master Xiao Jia, who was Kawa. The other was her mother, perfected Master Jia. She was an expert in the Tao of pills and was very popular in the carefree travel sect. Although she was almost 900 years old, time didn't leave any traces on her face. Instead, it added to her womanly charm. This was the specialty of Kuan cultivators, especially for a cultivator who was skilled in the Tao of pills. She wasn't in the Great Void Tao realm, but her daughter Ka Wa was. Therefore, when the perfected masters went out to try their luck, Ka Wa became one of them. For this reason, she spent a lot of effort to prepare the strongest team for her daughter to ensure her safety. She was very clear that her future was very limited. Her daughter was the continuation of her life. Therefore, she didn't hold back in helping her secretly. Kawa had been out in the void of the universe for almost 10 years without any news. Only recently did a returning cultivator bring her accurate news. Kawa and her group of 6 were heading towards the bottomless abyss cave. This made her very uneasy. The bottomless abyss cave was a very famous place in the surrounding dozens of universes. It wasn't a celestial phenomenon, but a place where a connate spiritual treasure resided. Because of its own characteristics, it formed a place similar to a celestial phenomenon. However, in essence, this was an additional effect of the connate spiritual treasure. This spiritual treasure had a characteristic that all the races and orthodoxies in the nearby universes understood. It was greedy. It almost wouldn't let go of any spiritual object that passed through the bottomless abyss cave's celestial phenomenon. It took collecting as a hobby and didn't care about raw or cooked objects. Its appetite was extremely good. Among them were great Tao fragments. Chapter 970. In the dozens of universes nearby, there were 3 most famous innate spiritual treasures. They were all in different states. The heaven and earth chessboard in the Zhou upper realm was one of them. It was a defensive spiritual treasure that belonged to the Zhou upper realm. It acted based on its instincts, and its intelligence was forever stuck at the state when the chaos was first created. Hence, it could be very high or very low. However, innate spiritual treasures existed forever. They were not something that humans could covet and possess. They could only be borrowed. Many middle-level and low-level cultivators thought that it was a Taoist item of some great cultivator. This was not accurate. It did not belong to anyone, only to the Zhou upper realm. Taiposhi was one of them. He wandered around, and his state was uncertain. The other was the cave of the ruins of the end. This innate spiritual treasure called itself the cave of the ruins of the end, but it was a true innate spiritual treasure of the half-immortal realm. Its biggest hobby was to collect, even if it did not use it. However, the rules of the heavenly Tao allowed them to enter and not leave. Hence, every 500 years, the cave of the ruins of the end would be opened for a period of time, allowing all kinds of living beings to enter the cave of the ruins of the end to search for those strange things. The fragments of the Great Void Tao belonged to the category of being collected. This was because the cave of the ruins of the end was located in a special space. It was a very strategic airspace. In the words of the mortals, it was an important transportation route. It was also the route that all kinds of spiritual beings had to pass through. As long as they passed through, there was a high chance that they would be captured by the cave of the ruins of the end. Of course, it could be said that the capture was not very accurate. It could also be said that the cave of the ruins of the end had set up a complicated fishnet maze here, causing these strange beings to lose their sense of direction in this space and be kept here. No one knew how many fragments of the Great Void Tao there were. However, if they were to be distributed among the various universes, this number was relatively small. If a cultivator wanted to find such a small fragment in the vast universe, it would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. Luck was the most important thing. No one could be sure of which universe and where they could find such a thing. Hence, the cultivator's approach was basically to gather spiritual energy and wander around, testing their luck. However, there was a place where fragments of the Great Void Tao definitely existed. That was the cave of the ruins of the end. A few years later, the opening period was just around the corner. Many cultivators had set their sights on this place, hoping to enter the ruins of End's cave domain and find the great Tao fragments that were bound to exist. In this place, there was at least a definite goal and not a pure competition of luck. Of course, in this place, there might be a competition of strength. This was what enlightened Master Jia was worried about. At that time, a large number of Yuanying would enter the returning ruins cave to fight for the limited fragments. Competition was inevitable and life and death were certain. Kawa would be in the middle of it all, so how could she guarantee that she would obtain a fragment? He might even lose his life inside. Most importantly, the bottomless ruin cave didn't just intercept void Grand Tao fragments. It would intercept other Grand Tao fragments as well. For example, the virtue Grand Tao fragment from a few hundred years ago. In other words, not only did Taoists enter the ruins of End, there were also monks. The conflict between Taoists and Buddhists was restrained in the domain, but in the void of the universe, everyone was unscrupulous. In the bottomless ruin cave, even if they weren't fighting for the same thing, disputes were inevitable. This was even more fatal than the disputes between Taoists, because you couldn't even establish a friendship with your opponent. Kawa was a stubborn person. As a mother, she knew her daughter's character very well. If she really entered the life and death winch, she would most likely be doomed. In the void of the universe, she could find strong helpers for her daughter, but in the bottomless ruin cave, she couldn't do so. As the bottomless ruin cave had a weird temper, it hated being disturbed the most. Therefore, only cultivators with suitable Tao realm were allowed to enter, and other helpers were rejected. In other words, only cultivators with great void Tao realm with merit had the right to enter. The 5 experienced Yuanying that she found could only wait outside the bottomless ruin cave for news. Jinren still felt that she could only make a trip. It wasn't that she could enter, but she had to make use of her connections outside the bottomless ruin cave. She didn't only have connections in the Carefree Mountain, she also had connections in other Taoist sects in Zhoushan. Through the transfer benefits, she might be able to find a few who were willing to give up their own needs and help Kawa. This possibility was very small. What kind of benefits, what kind of elixir could make people give up the possibility of attaining Tao? Even though she knew the chances were slim, she was still willing to give it a try. What if there were really such people? In her life, she made and destroyed the Tao of Dan. She hadn't left the void of the universe for many years, and she was unfamiliar with the cruelty that she hadn't experienced for a long time. But now, she had to move forward alone. Because in the current Carefree Mountain, there weren't many powerful Yuanying who were willing to make this trip. After arranging the affairs at hand, Jinren jumped out of the Qi layer and came to the void of the universe. She felt a sense of pride in her heart. Even if she hadn't come out for many years, the depth of the Tao of Dan couldn't be measured by ordinary people. She calmed herself down and stood on the conveyance light. Before she started, there was a breath approaching from the side. This made her very surprised. Was the universe so chaotic that there was an accident when she just left the Qi layer? Soon, a seemingly familiar Taoist appeared in her line of sight. He said politely, "I'm sorry. Jinren Jia, you're going on a long journey. I'm willing to escort you. Jinren also remembered. This Jinren was born in Little Lu and had some roots. He had some unclear connections with a certain great cultivator in the Carefree Mountain. He had caused a stir in the Jindan class. It could be said that he was one of the most outstanding Jindan cultivators in Zhou. However, Yuanying and Jindan were different. One was in the domain, while the other was in the void of the universe. The difference was huge, and their strength couldn't be compared. Jindan was powerful, so Yuanying was also powerful. This kind of argument didn't exist in the cultivation world. It seemed that this person hadn't been in the nascent soul realm for long. A few decades? He was a few decades later than his daughter. With this kind of experience, he was a complete newbie in the universe. Escort her? It was more like the other way around. But no matter what, this was a kind gesture. Kawa treated him well. For him to step forward at this time, he could be considered to be a little responsible. His attitude was amiable. Fellow Taoist Dan, you're too kind. Although the void is dangerous, I'm not unfamiliar with it. I'm not old yet, so how can I protect you? You're also in the great void Tao realm? Lu Xiaoyi didn't want to explain too much. Even if he explained, it wouldn't be clear. Would that evil tenant just refuse to leave? Since he was already prepared to help, he had to have a reason to help. Yes, I've also cultivated the great void Tao. I should be able to enter, right? I can even help senior apprentice Sister Jia. Jinren Jia sighed. As expected, this person's motives weren't pure. Perhaps his intention to help Kawa was true, but it was probably more for her. The universe was vast. With her leading the way, a newbie like him wouldn't have to worry about losing his way. The human heart in the cultivation world was unpredictable. She had to be on guard. There were many great cultivators who spoke highly of themselves and looked dignified, but in reality, they were just putting on a false front. There were too many of them. She couldn't control the disgust in her heart, but her rationality told her that people like Jinren Jia were probably the ones who were truly motivated by benefits and would work hard for her daughter. Those with strong Tao hearts wouldn't even give her a chance. Chapter 971. Under enlightened Master Jia's lead, the two of them flew towards the depths of the universe. The Cave of the End of Ruins was 2 universes away from the Zhou Upper Realm. Fortunately, the universes here weren't too big, so they could arrive in about a year. However, if they carefully calculated the opening time of the Cave of the End of Ruins, they definitely wouldn't be able to arrive before it opened. This was also the reason why enlightened Master Jia hurriedly set off when she heard the news. Enlightened Master Jia had a small void fairy that was extremely fast. This was not something that every nascent soul cultivator could afford. One needed to have experience, wealth, and a long accumulation of nascent soul cultivators. However, these things were not a problem for Pill Dao cultivators. They were the wealthiest group of cultivators, and there was no other. It could barely squeeze 2 people in. They flew all the way. Lu Xiaoyi was in a good mood because he had a beauty with him. Since they were cultivators, of course, they should abandon those mortal thoughts. In the mortal world, if you were traveling with your friend's mother, you would be an elder and someone you should respect. However, in the cultivation world, a few hundred years of age difference wasn't a problem at all. Everyone was in the Yuanying realm, so they were of the same generation. It didn't matter if you were 1,000 years old or 500 years old. You couldn't still call each other uncle, auntie, or great-grandpa, great-grandpa. Only mortals would think this way. Lu Xiaoyi wasn't a mortal. Time didn't just make people old, it also made people younger. Enlightened Master Jia was very experienced in controlling the fairy. It seemed that she had spent a lot of time in the void of the universe when she was young, relying on her fast speed and rich experience. Many unnecessary troubles were avoided by her skillful handling skills. To her, the only purpose of this trip was to get to the Cave of the End of Ruins as soon as possible and then find one or more cultivators who were willing to give up the great Tao fragment for benefits. Therefore, although she was a little disgusted by this guy who was using her as an excuse to repay a debt of gratitude, she had no choice but to put in some effort and pretend to be polite. Swordsman's path is the Great Void. This is very rare in the cultivation world. Junior apprentice brother Sean is young and promising. You really don't take the usual path. Lu Xiaoyi was very polite. Walking blindly is also a coincidence. Senior apprentice sister should also know that the choices on the path of cultivation are sometimes involuntary. How can there be a complete self? Taoist Master Jia guided him patiently. On the path of cultivation, the Tao of pills is the most important. This is the case for both low-level and high-level cultivators. I wonder what junior brother knows about the pills of the Yuanying stage? Lu Xiaoyi was, of course, confused. Does Yuanying still need to take drugs? Wasn't it something that Jade purity and Z purity could solve? I've always been ignorant in this aspect. Please don't laugh at me. Senior Marshal's sister, Taoist Master Jia, appeared to be very patient. You are mistaken. Actually, Taoist Master Yuanying also needs pills. Otherwise, do you think there are so many Jade Purity, Purple Purity pills in the universe for great cultivators to use? The most taboo thing for cultivators is to be biased. This is especially true for the sore vein. Pills are the great Tao, not poison. As long as you choose the right balance, it is extremely beneficial to a cultivator's cultivation. Well, I heard Kawa say that your cultivation is growing slowly. I guess that it must be because you don't use pills. If you use pills properly, you will reach the peak of the Gene Dance stage at least 50 years earlier. There are countless possibilities that cannot be ignored. How about it? Are you interested in learning more about the pills of the Yuanying stage? The days passed under Taoist Master Jia's conscious Tao of pills until Lu Xiaoyi finally understood that this Taoist master's true intention was to provide large amounts of Yuanying pills in exchange for him giving up on obtaining the Great Void Fragment and helping Kawa instead. This was a beautiful misunderstanding, but he was too lazy to explain. Those who were truly familiar with him knew that since he had already done it, there was no reason for him to back down. Moreover, to use external objects to tempt him, Lu Xiaoyi, this sort of thing had probably not appeared in the universe yet. As for his so-called Great Void Tao, there was no way to explain it. As for the Cave of the Ruins of the End, why is it restricted to Yuanying only? Can't perfected monarchs fuse with great Tao fragments? Lu Xiaoyi was bored and could only ask this question. There is a lot of information about these innate spiritual treasures in the Carefree Mountain sect's ancient records, but he did not have enough time to investigate. Taoist Master Jia explained, the Cave of the Ruins of the End is really in the half-immortal realm. But you also know that in terms of ability, human cultivators have about half a realm of difference compared to spiritual treasures and ancient beasts of the same realm. If human perfected monarchs enter the space of the Ruins of the End, it is very difficult to completely control them. If more people enter, some restless ones will do something. The Cave of the Ruins of the End is a little stingy. It is most afraid of people doing something to its treasures, so it simply does not allow any perfected monarchs to enter. After hundreds of thousands of years, this rule has been formed. Only Yuanying cultivators are allowed to enter. The rest are not welcomed. What kind of space is the Cave of the Ruins of the End? Is it a normal space in the universe, but separated by a boundary? Or is there something else? This was what Lu Xiaoyi was most concerned about. Taoist Master Jia knew that this was because he rarely cared about these innate spiritual treasures. They usually appeared in the hands of new Yuanying cultivators. As for those old immortals, they had long understood this through their long life rings. So why would they ask such a childish question now? There is no fixed number. It is determined by the mood of the Cave of the Ruins of the End. There are fights over the space in the universe, and there are also games that change the scenery. The reason why the Cave of the True Monarch only allows Yuanying cultivators to enter is because Yuanying cultivators are more suitable for its control, unlike perfected monarchs, who can expose its tricks if they are not careful. What are the details? Lu Xiaoyi pursued. Taoist Master Jia could only explain. For example, in one session, all the Yuanying cultivators who entered were implanted in a book world, suppressing their ability to be like mortals. Then, the ownership of the great Tao fragments was decided based on the ranking of the imperial examinations. Another time, it turned everyone's minds into prehistoric beasts, allowing them to tear each other apart. The strongest and the most ruthless would win. There are many more, such as battlefields, low-level martial arts worlds, invading plants, and so on. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Isn't this a bit too much? What about the dignity of cultivators? Taoist Master Jia sighed. But it didn't invite you. You were greedy and wanted to gain something from it. So it can't be blamed for deliberately humiliating those who entered. Under the rules of the heavenly Tao, innate spiritual treasures can't casually slaughter other creatures and can't hide its collection forever. It also has a stingy personality, so during this process, it has to vent its anger so that it can feel better. But it has nothing to do with cultivators killing each other, right? Lu Xiaoyi understood a bit. Taoist Master Jia smiled bitterly. It's like this. There should be a limit, right? Outsiders have no way of knowing the exact balance. But in the most serious case, nearly half of the cultivators didn't come out. This is why I'm worried about Kawa. Chapter 972. In less than a year, Taoist Master Jia, who missed his daughter, rushed to the sky region where the returning ruins cave was located. Because the returning ruins cave was about to open, the density of cultivators in the surroundings had obviously increased. Groups of cultivators wandered around, occasionally fighting. Fortunately, it didn't become a large-scale battle. Perfected Master Jia slowly got off the raft and looked at the young man who refused to accept the elixirs. She didn't know if this guy was really against elixirs or if he was deliberately rejecting her suggestion and insisting on fusing with the shard of Tao. But one thing was clear, this guy had no interest in her daughter, just like how Kawa didn't have any romantic feelings for him. With her rich life experience, she could even guess the reason. That was because the way this guy looked at her was not like how one would look at an elder. It was like he was looking at her naked. This was a pervert. Fortunately, her daughter didn't end up with this guy. Otherwise, who knew what kind of trouble he would cause? Sacrificing herself to get a helper for her daughter? This idea was too crazy, and she didn't think that this guy had enough ability to guarantee that he could help Kawa. He was useless, but it was a pity to abandon him. Last question. After entering the ultimate ruin cave, can cultivators still retain their original memories? If not, how can I distinguish Kawa? Can I consciously help her? Perfected Master Jia finally heaved a sigh of relief. No matter if it was real or fake, at least on the surface, this guy knew what he should do. The biggest characteristic of the ultimate ruin cave is that it's not fixed. There doesn't seem to be a fixed pattern or a pattern of behavior. In order to be able to distinguish each other in the ultimate ruin, our method is like this. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head in his heart. He was not sure about anything. This was very difficult. He hated being controlled by others or being in a state where he lost part of himself. Just like that time when he had his memory regressed. If he couldn't use what he learned to wield a sword, what was the point of cultivation? There was nothing he could do about it. Since he was already here, he could not go in. He didn't know if he could influence the situation, but his own safety was still guaranteed. Not to mention the fact that nearly half of the cultivators had survived the cruelest time. Even if there were only a few left, he was confident that he could protect himself. After getting off the raft, he saw Taoist Master Jia wandering around, looking for familiar and possible Taoist helpers. He sighed in his heart. It really wasn't easy being a mother. Her child was already yuanning, but she still had to go through so much trouble. There was no point in thinking too much about it. The returning ruins cave had already been open for half a year. He might as well go in and take a look. The cave of the returning ruins had opened, but it also hadn't. The cultivators had been entering since half a year ago, one after another. This was also a characteristic of the cave of returning ruins. It was open and there was no one presiding over it. In a sense, it was more like a huge illusion. There was only one master of the illusory realm, Truth Cave. It hated humans who were obsessed with its collection the most. Unfortunately, The rules of heaven didn't allow it to keep its treasures. It had to open it regularly, so its malice wasn't completely without reason. Slowly, it became an ornament of its long life, a playtime to pass time and relieve its loneliness. It couldn't casually attack these humans, but if it could see them killing each other, it could always get a little satisfaction from it. How would the scene in the Returning Ruins cave appear? It was a mystery to the humans. Only it knew how to choose which scene to play with these humans. Pre-celestial spiritual treasures were the least imaginative among all intelligent creatures, because they didn't have a life. Without a life, without experiencing the world of mortals, it didn't have the messy thoughts of humans, those unimaginable situations and societies. However, it could clearly reproduce these in every illusory realm. This was the source of its irregular, illusory realm. Although it didn't have the experience of human life and scenes, these humans did. Due to certain restrictions, it couldn't directly search the souls of the cultivators. This might also cause harm to the cultivators. However, with its ability as a half-immortal, it could easily see the past lives of the cultivators. Then, it chose a scene in the past lives of the cultivators that it thought was interesting and became the basis for its illusory realm. Therefore, there was no pattern. Before it opened the Returning Ruins cave, it didn't even know what kind of scene it was going to create this time. After the cultivators entered, it watched the past lives of the cultivators one by one, just like watching a short movie. Some of the movies were very boring, while some were very thrilling and exciting. If it found something that it was interested in, it would carefully copy it, making it the big show this time, and it couldn't stop enjoying it. In the beginning, it had no choice but to make such a choice. After all, there was no way it could come up with such complicated rules on its own, like the Imperial examination system. However, as the number of times the Ultimate opened increased, and the number of short films it watched increased, it realized that it could no longer live without this kind of feeling. It started to have an interest in the human world. Even if it couldn't experience it personally, it could still find joy in it through the past lives of the humans. Just like this time, the reason why it wasn't in a hurry to open the Returning Ruins cave was because it wanted to find a past that interested it in the past lives of the cultivators that entered. It had to be interesting, cruel, exciting, and different from the past. It was getting harder and harder to achieve this because it had experienced the vicissitudes of life for tens of thousands of years. Unless it lowered its standards, it wouldn't be easy to find a very novel life experience. Originally, it had already chosen a scene from the cultivators that were present. It was a little unsatisfactory, but at least it avoided repetition. However, the arrival of a human forced it to stop the construction of the illusory realm. To the numinous treasures, in theory, their will wouldn't change with humans. Since the birth of the universe, the numinous treasures race had been independent of the world. They never participated in the disputes between the various races and the orthodoxies, maintaining an eternal neutrality. This was in theory, but in reality, when other races of the same realm made a request, as long as it wasn't excessive, they would try their best to satisfy it. Even if they were neutral, they had to have neutral wisdom and couldn't be delusional. The person who came was an eminent monk, a half-immortal monk. He didn't make any requests, nor did he threaten or intimidate. He just came here as if he met an existence of the same realm by chance, and stopped to ask for a cup of tea, discuss the great Tao, and lament about the changes in the cultivation world of the universe. The two of them reached a consensus. The great Tao collapsed, the heavenly Tao was flawed, and the upper realm was easy. There should be a balanced mechanism, a method of elimination, and not be as timid as before, fearing that the heavenly Tao would be dissatisfied if too many cultivators died. This was the sin of the heavenly Tao itself. Chapter 973. The monk did not say anything about the ruins of Sinkhole's illusory realm, but his arrival was a form of attitude. From history, Buddhists had more deaths than Taoists in the ruins of Sinkhole's illusory realm. This was in line with the strength comparison of the universe's cultivation world. Taoists were the first, Buddhists were the second. There was no reason for the first to suffer greater losses than the second. This was the wisdom of the numinous treasure race's eternal neutrality. They were very clear on how to achieve balance in this complicated cultivation world, and would never make a choice that deviated from the trend. But now, the trend didn't just change. Instead, it had become complicated. The monk's words implied that using those illusory methods that could not represent a cultivator's true strength to determine the ownership of the fragments was really against the principles of cultivators to defy the heavens. Therefore, it was best to rely on one's own ability and not take the imperial examinations, play the battlefield, disguise as ancient beasts, and other boring methods. In view of Buddhists' more stoic nature, they were often at a disadvantage in those messy competitions and could not compare to the variety of Taoists. Most of the 3,000 unorthodox groups came from Taoists. There were all kinds of schools, and they learned all kinds of things. But Buddhists were more specialized. If they were all placed in the mortal world and suppressed their own abilities, some Taoists would be like fish in water, while all the monks would be a loss. The ruins of Sinkhole's cavern knew that it was definitely not the only connate numinous treasure that the Buddhist monk had found. In countless universes, there are countless connate acquired numinous treasures like it doing the same thing as it, coming into contact with human cultivators, providing them with an environment, embedding the numinous treasure race's eternal neutrality in the process of human growth and the concept of education without discrimination, so as to protect the numinous treasure race's position in the immortal world's change. Buddhists were starting to exert their strength in various universes. First, through the operation of the numinous treasure, they supported Buddhism and suppressed Taoism without leaving a trace. At the very least, they had to change the situation of Buddhist disciples being at a disadvantage in the past. The ruins of Sinkhole's cavern was hesitating. It was not difficult to do what this monk wished for. In the past, most of those who entered the ruins of Sinkhole were Taoists, and there were not many monks. But this time was different. Although there were many Taoists in Taoism, there were not many Taoists in the Great Void Tao, because there were too many Taoists to comprehend. In addition, there were those who felt that they were not strong enough, those who were arrogant and did not want to be manipulated, and some other reasons. Therefore, the Taoists who came this time were not as swarming as expected. On the other hand, the Buddhists had a limited number of Tao realm cultivators. The merit Tao had a revered status in the Buddhist monasteries. Nearly 50% of the Buddhists focused on this aspect. As such, the opening of the Sinkhole cave resulted in a rare tie between the Buddhist disciples and the Taoist disciples. They had the foundation to be evenly matched. How could he do it without leaving any traces? Since he would not offend this monk who was right in front of him, he would not offend the Taoist leader as well. This was a problem that tested its ability to balance. As for the setting, there was no need to choose anymore. It was a pure, cosmic void form. Only in this way could the cultivator truly unleash their own abilities. It was a relief. This was also the first time it was in its original universe, since it had its own ruins of and illusory realm. The only thing that needed to be considered was the issue of the rules. There were thousands of monks and Taoists. If they were to engage in a chaotic battle, there would be no way to control them. To a soul that would not even let go of the spiritual objects that floated past in the universe, the desire to control was the cornerstone of its character. It would not allow too many accidents. That would usually mean that it would suffer more losses. Kawa and a few of the Carefree Travel sect disciples stood together. They were the first batch to enter the ruins of End. They had already waited for half a year and were not impatient. This was the temper of the ruins of End. It procrastinated and dawdled because it could not bear to part with its so-called treasures. There were a total of 5 people from the Carefree Travel sect who came here. It was not to say that the Carefree Travel sect only had 5 Yuanying Tao realm cultivators. It was just that only the 5 of them came. The rest had their own reasons. Most of them were ascetic cultivators who did not seek the will of the heavens and only believed in themselves. Around them, there were less than 100 Taoists from the upper realm of Zhou Xian. There were those from the 7 upper sects and those from the 3,000 minor lands. Here, they naturally formed a circle. Although they did not know what would happen when the ruins of End was truly opened, they were still a group for now. They were not stupid and knew the meaning of grouping together. In theory, if they could establish a mechanism to recognize each other, they would have the foundation to cooperate. However, in the space of half-immortals, normal methods would not work at all. If they wanted to establish a deeper connection, they would face the problem of exposing their own core mystery. Who would trust others so easily? In the end, they were actually competitors. It would be better if they did not know each other when they made their moves. There would be no psychological pressure. Kawa's expression was solemn. She did not have the so-called worries of her mother in her heart. The path of cultivation was full of thorns. How could there be absolute peace? She and the few old infants that her mother had asked to come out. In fact, they had come for the ruins of End from the very beginning. This was because she knew very well how rare it was to coincidentally encounter a fragment of the ruins of End in a vast universe. She was not the daughter of fate. Moreover, there was no fate now. Everyone was in control of themselves. Heaven's luck was no longer there. Since she had come to the void of the universe, her mother's restrictions were nothing to her. Hence, she came here and began her own struggle. She was not brainless. From the history of the ruins of End space, there had never been a time when it was decided through a real battle between cultivators. Basically, it was through some kind of illusion. It tested the cultivators' overall quality, adaptability, knowledge, and so on. She still had a chance to fight. If it was purely a battle of strength, she would not have come. She was very clear about her own ability. She was not that perverted. As they waited, they finally felt a change in the space. Everyone knew that it was about to begin. There are 12 branches of the heavenly stem. Each branch has its own great Tao. Taoism and Buddhism each have half. It is up to heaven's will to fight. There was a loud sound in the space. This was the rule of fighting for the fragment of the great Tao. Zicho, Yin Mao, Chun Si Wu Wei, Shun Yu Su Hai. The 12 branches opened at the same time. In other words, there were 12 spaces. Each space had a fragment of the great Tao to fight for. However, it was uncertain whether it was the Tao or the Great Void. The total number was fixed. 6 fragments of merit and 6 fragments of the Great Void. It was definitely not all that the ruins of End's cave had. However, if it was not willing to take them all out, others could not do anything to it. Cultivators could choose which branch to enter. It was half luckier. That was because one might not be able to find a suitable fragment of the great Tao. The ruins of End's cave chose to enter 12 branches with the intention of dividing the crowd. Thousands of people would fight for the 12 fragments at the same time. A chaotic battle was unavoidable. Moreover, it was certain that after entering the space, the first thing that the cultivators would do was to fight against Taoism and Buddhism. To the ruins of End's cave, this was very difficult to control. Even if there was a half-immortal monk beside it, it was not willing to let the situation go completely out of control. Later on, the monk would just leave it here to clean up its mess. In a small area, a space with 100 people was very suitable. It could influence the overall situation. Chapter 974. P.S. Today is the last day of the double. Those who have tickets, please accept them, Kawa sighed. She had no chance at all in such a way. No matter which of the 12 spaces she entered, there would be hundreds of opponents waiting for her. Not to mention the monks, they were natural enemies. Even her fellow Taoist companions, who would be willing to give up their own fated chance to help her. She couldn't open her mouth. She thought it would be the same as before, but she didn't expect the ruins of the End to adopt the most unskilled method, which was to draw a space and snatch it. 12 rays of light descended. Those were the entrances to the 12 spaces. How to enter was a test of the Taoist orthodoxy style. Some forces chose to enter as a group, but they were the minority. The biggest advantage of doing so was that they could support each other during a fight and share weal and woe together. Their safety was guaranteed. However, the disadvantage was obvious. What if the great Tao fragment in this space was not what they needed? Or, if they were lucky enough to snatch the right to use the fragment, who would be the one to fuse it? Cultivators, after all, cultivated individually, not as a group. There was no reason to be modest at this time. Most of the cultivators chose to enter separately. The advantage was that they could do whatever they wanted. For the entire sect, there would be a time when they would encounter the fragment. They wouldn't have to fight to the death only to realize that their efforts were in vain. The downside was that they would be fighting alone and their safety would be worrying. However, for cultivators, this wasn't a big problem. Those who were able to reach this step weren't afraid of death. Those who were cowardly wouldn't come. Those who came had no regard for life or death. The few cultivators of the carefree travel sect looked at each other. There was no need for discussion. They could understand each other's intentions. There was no reason for them to gather and gamble. The orthodoxy of the carefree travel sect had always been free and independent. This was their tradition. Here, there was no distinction between men and women. No one should be taken care of. Ever since she stepped into the cultivation world, Kawa understood this very well. Unfortunately, her mother didn't understand. Looking at the few senior brothers entering the rays of light, the other Zhou Xian Taoists did the same. They didn't choose to group up. However, Buddhism was the exact opposite. Almost all of them chose the 12 branches according to the nature of their sections. For example, the 10,000 Buddhas chose the sun, the ascetic Zen chose the ugly, and so on. This kind of unity could no longer be simply attributed to the style of the orthodoxy. It was more likely to be a kind of overall arrangement. It had to be said that this kind of arrangement was more effective. Although Kawa was disappointed, it didn't mean that she would stop moving forward. It was impossible for her to find a team with fewer people to enter. This was because the cultivators were very smart. Everyone would choose the team with the least number of people when they entered. As a result, the number of people entering the 12 teams was basically the same. There was no one with more people and no one with fewer people. In the end, she chose Celestial. While avoiding her fellow disciples from the Xiao Yao sect, she chose this branch not because there were more people in this branch, but because she liked this name. Since she was just trying her luck, why not find someone she liked? She bumped into the ray of light. She felt nothing. Only the 12 rays of light in the sky were no longer there. Everything else, including the stars and meteorites in the sky, did not change at all. She understood that this was the ruins of N's cave's great magic power. It divided the sky and the real world into 12 different spaces. The ratio of each space to the real world was exactly the same. The advantage was that the space was big enough. It wouldn't feel crowded even if hundreds of Yuanying were to play in it. When she entered the celestial branch space, she didn't see any cultivators around her. This was also the reason why the space was big enough. She knew very well that the shard of the Great Tao would not appear quickly. Since it was a game, the cards would not be revealed too early. Otherwise, who would stay here to play? The ruins of N's cave had made it very clear. If the shard was taken, the space would be gone. Everyone knew very well what they were doing and whether they had a chance. She flew forward aimlessly. In such a harsh environment, what she wanted to see the most now was the whereabouts of people. Even if they were enemies, at least she would know what to do. No one knew how big the ruins of N's space was. Its size was determined by the will of the ruins of N's cave. Hence, what she could do now was to measure this space and know the distribution of the stars. She wanted to see if she could use it. After flying for a while, a few strong auras came from the front. The majestic Buddha's light shone brightly like a lamp in the dark night. Kawa did not hesitate. She turned around and ran. Not to mention that she was a Taoist with average combat power. Even a Taoist who was good at fighting would run first in such a situation. Cultivators were not afraid of death, but they were not courting death. The range of her spiritual perception was obviously not as wide as the monks. When she discovered the other party, the monks also discovered her. They immediately started their pursuit. Kawa could be considered to have wandered the universe for many years. Her escape and concealment techniques were not weak. Furthermore, her mother had put in a lot of effort in this aspect. She had almost spared no effort in throwing resources into it. Her equipment was considered very rich among cultivators of the same realm. Because it was a long-range, spiritual perception search beyond the horizon, it was easier to escape in such a state. Kawa's response was simple and effective. When she passed by a small meteorite, she released a paper puppet from the back of the meteorite. At the same time, she lowered her body onto the meteorite and entered the state of breath control. The paper puppet was specially made for her by her mother. Its aura fluctuations were very similar to hers. It was a bait. After flying on its own for a period of time, it would self-destruct. At this time, she had already escaped in the opposite direction. This was a very clever escape tactic. She had not come here unprepared. No one who came here was a pure sheep. As expected, the monks fell for the trick. For this kind of pursuit beyond the horizon, escaping was common. It was not strange. Spiritual perception could help a cultivator reach far, but it also had its limitations. In a certain sense, each of the 6 senses was indispensable. Jiahua continued to wander around. She realized that she couldn't even do the simplest measurement of the size of the airspace here. There were always people she met, and she was always dodging, so there was no fixed direction. She extinguished this thought and began to doubt the meaning of her coming here. Was she just there to make up the numbers? Most people like her had entered the space of the ultimate, right? Harboring dreams, trying to pick up a loophole. She had encountered several waves of Taoist cultivators. Some were alone, and some were in groups. She only hid in groups and let the solo cultivators go. It was impossible to detect every aura, like a rat crossing the street. Then the cultivators had lost the meaning of cultivation. The solo Taoists were much more polite to each other. There was no basis for fighting. There was no benefit, and it could not be quickly resolved. Instead, it would affect the state of the real battle. They often left after reporting the movements of the bodhisattvas of Buddhism in this space. It was also unrealistic to form a group. They could not work together outside. So how could they rely on strangers after entering? Chapter 975. There were 2 auras in front of her. She could vaguely sense the concept of the great void in them. This was a technique that cultivators had to use to search for the fragments of the great Tao. Only by expanding the concept could one find the traces of the fragments outside the range of one's eyes and consciousness. It was like a vibration wave. When the wave met the fragments of the great void realm, it would cause a resonance and sense each other. It was the same for the monks. For example, Kawa discovered the Buddhist light of the monks. It was not that they were stupid and did not know how to hide it, but it was only through this method that they could search every space in a large area without missing anything. Just by relying on the human eye. Even if there were 10,000 cultivators, they would not be able to find such a small thing. Kawa did not plan to hide from these 2 auras. She was a little tired of this sneaky style. Moreover, there were 2 Taoists. If she could not beat them, she could at least run, right? The 2 Taoists were unfamiliar. One look, and she could tell that they were not people from the upper realm of Zhou. Among the Taoists who came to the Ultimate Ruins Cave, there were some who were vaguely hostile to Zhou. Most of them were irrelevant. As long as they did not come from those hostile realms, it was basically a chance encounter. The 2 Taoists looked righteous. One of them walked towards her. We are all from the same Tao lineage. We should help each other. Junior sister, you are alone and have no one to rely on. Why don't we work together so that we can take care of each other? Kawa cautiously retreated while releasing a smoke bomb. My fellow disciples are waiting for me. Thank you for your kindness. I shall not disturb you. The Taoist in front was still approaching. Junior sister, why do you keep us at arm's length? We are all from the same Tao lineage. Why will we harm you? Kawa decisively increased her speed. At the same time, she added a protective barrier to herself. As expected, in the next moment, the Taoist spell had already reached her. It was a dark, elemental prickle. It hit the barrier with a bang. The Taoist laughed and said, "The people of Zhou are indeed very cautious." The 2 of them swarmed forward and began to attack together. Kawa fought and retreated at the same time. She was still a little annoyed at her own carelessness, or maybe she was controlled by a kind of fluke. This kind of approach between strangers was actually a sign of bad intentions. If they really didn't have any bad intentions, they wouldn't even bother with you. They would just communicate with each other using their divine sense from afar. Why would they need to come closer? It was obvious that her identity had been seen through long ago. It was just that during the half year of waiting, she stood out from the crowd of cultivators in Joseon. If she had run away immediately, she would still have had a chance to escape. However, now that she was trapped in the spell's attack range, it was no longer possible for her to escape without hindrance. She had to defend and counterattack, so naturally, it was impossible for her to escape completely. Moreover, these two Taoists cooperated well. One of them attacked her directly, while the other kept blocking her with his enchantments, making it impossible for her to escape. What she didn't expect was that the first danger she encountered would come from a Taoist cultivator. This gave her a deeper understanding of the cruelty of the cultivation world. In this case, shouldn't everyone work together to deal with the Buddhists first? Although she was in a difficult situation, the spirit of a free and unfettered travel cultivator was relatively strong. There were no flaws in the use of spells. For a while, she could still fight and retreat at the same time. During this period, she met two passers-by, a monk and a Taoist. The Taoist chose to ignore them without hesitation because he felt that he had no choice. If he chose to help the woman, he might not succeed. Why would he hurt himself? He had no relatives or friends. Saving people was not in the cultivator's code of conduct. Even if he saved her, would the woman give the fragment to him? It was meaningless. He chose to help the two Taoists to fight 3 against 1, but he couldn't get over the hurdle in his heart. What if the remaining 2 attacked him after the battle? The selfishness and inexplicable inexplicability of Taoism were reflected incisively and vividly here. Of course, the monk wouldn't come to save her. 2 people were chasing a Kuan cultivator. She used her weak body to seduce others' chivalrous integrity. This was a standard trap, very old-fashioned. When he went up, it would immediately become 3 against 1. He was very sure. In a difficult situation, Kawa escaped from the main attacking cultivator's various forbidden spells. When she saw an opportunity, she counterattacked. This was exactly her best skill, void crossing of cold. This was one of her few trump cards and spells. It was strange in that it was silent and strong, in that it could break the Dharma body. As soon as the spell was cast, the small enchantment that had been hindering and delaying the harassing cultivator suddenly changed. The enchantment sharpened and penetrated the cultivator's body like a needle. At this moment, Kawa finally understood how fragile she was in front of experienced cultivators. She thought that the strong attacker was the harasser. She thought that the harasser was the main attacker. The opportunity she saw was just deliberately revealed by others to lure her to make a move. When she made a move and her magic power was weak, the cultivator who had been using the small enchantment to harass her would immediately change from harassment to attack and succeed in one fell swoop. The magic was that it was not just a spell, but a direct conversion of the power of the enchantment. The advantage of this was that it could be done in an instant, leaving the opponent no time to react. The disadvantage was that it was not strong enough, so it was difficult to kill directly. Kawa realized that she had become a funnel now. The consumption of her magic power instantly increased by several times. She could not attack, she could not defend, and she could not escape. Life and death were suddenly placed in front of her. With my ability, I am really lucky to have fallen to such a state now. Kawa was very emotional. At this moment, she finally understood her mother. Ever since her mother cultivated the Tao of pills, she had never come to the void of the universe. This was not because she was afraid, but because she knew her own limitations. Everyone had something they were good at. There was no need to force herself to fight. Although this was indeed very cool and was the eternal mainstream, a red flower also needed a green leaf to set it off. Why couldn't she be willing to be a green leaf? Now that she finally understood, it seemed a little late. Thinking of her mother, she could not help but force out a drop of blood from her heart. This was something that her mother had specially instructed her to refine. She said that when she reached the cave at the end of the ruins, no matter what kind of illusion environment it was, she could rely on this to find someone she could rely on. She knew what her mother meant. She was afraid that she would not know who to trust after losing her own memory. With this drop of blood, she would be able to sense it. But now, her mind and memory were not affected at all. If she used this drop of blood, would she still be able to achieve her goal? No matter what, she had to use it. She had already disobeyed her mother's instructions for a long time. Now this was the only thing she could do. She did not know if there would be another chance to serve her in the future. She stopped and no longer ran. If she was destined to wither, then let this moment be even more beautiful. Kawa did not think about anything else. She also wanted to know if she could be like that lunatic when she fought with her life on the line and take other people's lives. The possibility was very small because she had too few chances to fight with her life on the line. It was so rare that she could not grasp the propriety and control the rhythm when she was fighting with her life on the line. She still had to try. Then, she saw a trace of light from the side. It came from afar and instantly filled her vision. Chapter 976. In Kawa's eyes, the people who had to risk their lives to see if they could cause harm to the other party were like two puppets under the flying sword. When they saw the flying sword, the person who released the sword had already disappeared. When they saw the person who released the sword, the person who was stabbed by the flying sword had already died. The person and the sword were never in the same direction. It was as if they were separated from each other. You don't know where the sword came from, just like you don't know where the person went. Compared to her counterattack technique, would others consider blocking, intercepting, dodging, or resisting her technique? But the flying sword only gave people the feeling of life or death. The intensity of her battle was stretched too long while running. While the flying sword seemed to compress the potential of life to the extreme, it was just a moment of youth. In the 6 boxes of heaven and earth chessboard, she had seen this kind of sword technique, but that was in a different space of chess pieces. It was not as close as it was now. This made her once thought that although she was very strong, she could also do it in the future burst like a bubble under the current reality. This was not something that could be solved by thinking or practicing. It was the combination of all the factors she could think of. She finally understood that in front of everyone's different talents, hard work would pale in comparison. Moreover, she did not see this lunatic working harder. This guy, even in his dreams, was he thinking about how to kill people? The two once arrogant Taoists, under the flying sword, actually did not have the chance to attack her again, although they clearly knew that this woman could be the only weakness of this vicious person. Killing, in this guy's hands, had become an art. It was as if the death god was dancing. Then he stopped with a sly smile on his face. "Yo, seen your sister's stomach has been stabbed. Let me help you rub it." Kawa laughed and scolded. "Don't make fun of me. We are really looking for a meteorite. I may need a few hours to completely control my injuries." Lu Xiaoyi chose a small meteorite nearby. Kawa was still a little hesitant. "Isn't this place too close to the battlefield? There are still 2 bodies hanging there." Lu Xiaoyi said lightly, "This place is the best. If anyone passes by here, they should hide far away. Save the trouble. If you don't hide, I don't mind hanging a few more corpses up there." Kawa sighed. If other people said this, she would think that they were just bragging. But this person was different. If he said it, he would really do it. Her injuries were not light. But if she had enough time, and with the help of her mother's best yuan-ing pills, it would not be a big deal. What she needed to do was to repair her damaged meridians. If she was careless in this process, there would be repercussions. In the end, she didn't get the chance to put her life on the line. At the same time, she understood that she was probably not someone who would put her life on the line. Taking the initiative to fight for victory and passively fighting for survival were 2 different concepts. What she had done just now was no longer called risking her life, but seeking death because she had already lost something in the unseen world. She did not regret it. Even if she returned empty-handed from the sinkhole, she had obtained something more important. She had recognized herself and understood her mother. Here, I don't want to fight anymore. I like the Tao of Go and have some research on array formations. When I return, I will put more effort into this aspect. I can't be like you, fighting for your life in the universe. I'm not as lucky as you. Lu Xiaoyi laughed out loud. If his friend could unlock the shackles in her heart and find her true self, he wouldn't have made this trip in vain. As for the great Tao fragment, who could say for sure? Kawa would fight for it if she didn't fight for it. He was the opposite. He would not fight for it if he fought for it. No one was right or wrong. As long as it suited him, he would be happy. Hence, he went along with her. Senior sister, have you thought it through? Actually, I've long thought it through. I'll find a picturesque place to plant some flowers and grass, get married, and have a bunch of children. What a beautiful life. It's something I've yearned for a long time. Unfortunately, I haven't had the time. Kawa interrupted him very seriously. Here, you don't have to pretend to agree with me, to reassure me. Plant flowers? Compost corpses with fertilizer? There's no better or worse direction, and everyone's quality of life is different. I don't think that being able to fight in the universe is better than staying in the sect to cultivate. It's the same the other way around. So, you don't have to say such nonsense to comfort me. You don't have to waste the flowers and grass. Lu Xiaoyi was very thick-skinned, so he didn't feel embarrassed at being exposed. While guarding Kawa to heal, he secretly checked the details of the battle just now. This was his habit. After every battle, he would reflect on himself, retrace the process of the battle, find out his shortcomings, and improve. He would also ponder on how to strike faster and more ferociously, and how to move in a more unpredictable and more abrupt manner. His battle prowess was also constantly improving under this kind of relentless research. However, he would not be complacent and stop moving forward just because he had smoothly killed 2 nascent soul cultivators. It hadn't even been 100 years since he reached the nascent soul stage. In the cultivation world, he was still considered a newcomer. This was especially evident in his cultivation. There was still a huge gap between him and a late Yuanian cultivator. This was something that couldn't be avoided. However, he also had an advantage. This advantage came from the fact that he was different from the rest since he was in Jindan. Although he had never competed with others before, the celestial pill he had back then was a first-class high-grade pill. It was also the reason why he was able to compete with experts of the same level with a lower cultivation. Now that he had reached the nascent soul stage, this advantage still existed. It didn't shrink, but instead expanded. When people talked about cultivation, they usually referred to the thickness, volume, and even purity of the cultivation. This was how the Dharma Meridians referred to it. Because it occupied a mainstream position in the cultivation world, it was recognized by the cultivation world. However, in reality, there was another important indicator of cultivation: compression and refinement. The thickness of the cultivation would determine the power of a cultivator's spells, the duration of their spells, recovery ability, and multiple control. These were all things that Dharma Meridian cultivators valued and were highly respected. However, the compression and refinement of cultivation only determined one direction: explosive power. Explosive power. How much magic power could be released in a unit of time? This was the most important indicator of a swordsman's strength. This was especially true in the Xianyuan sword faction, where the inner sword faction was highly respected. There were even some extreme swordsmen who would shout the slogan of exploding everything in one go. That was to use all the magic power in the body the moment the sword was drawn. Only then would the flying sword be truly invincible. As for after that, who would care so much? The Dharma Meridian cultivators wouldn't think of things this way. This was a different understanding of battle from different orthodoxies. Lu Xiaoyi naturally stood firmly on the side of the sword vein. To him, it didn't matter how long he could last in the battle. What was important was how quickly he could end the battle. The direction of his cultivation was also consciously or unconsciously leaning towards this direction. That was why he had this perverted nascent soul. Because of the abundance of celestial pills, he had spent several times more clear spirit chi than normal cultivators when he was forming his nascent soul. Furthermore, he had the Taipu ancient spirit that was completely connected to his heart. With such a huge amount of resources, the result was a 1-inch nascent soul that was much smaller than a normal 3-inch nascent soul. One could imagine how terrifying the compression and refinement of this 1-inch nascent soul was. Chapter 977. Lu Xiaoyi's cultivation wasn't worth mentioning among Yuanying cultivators. He was only at the early stage of Yuanying. However, he could unleash the same amount of spiritual power that only late-stage Yuanying cultivators could achieve. If coupled with his incomparably strong spiritual power, when he fought with others, he would be an old nascent soul stage cultivator after a few strikes. After a few strikes, he would become a normal nascent soul stage cultivator. After dozens of strikes, he would reveal his true form and become a rookie. Of course, by then, he would have already run far away. It was a very shameless way of fighting. It was to control the sword. This way of cultivation required an astronomical amount of spiritual power. Because it had to be compressed into the Yuanying cultivator's body, the spiritual power was denser and the loss was greater. Last time, when he went with Xia Bingji, she felt that it was enough for her to use for a few decades. However, to Lu Xiaoyi, it was only 10 years. This was a huge trap. It meant that he didn't have to worry about resources when he was in the Jin dance stage. Instead, it appeared during the Yuanying stage. This was also the reason why he had always rejected Jinrenjia's offer of pills during the Yuanying stage. Normally, pills were beneficial to the Yuanying cultivator's body and could increase the speed of cultivation. Because the Yuanying cultivator's body wouldn't be too refined, a small amount of impurities could be expelled during cultivation. However, it was completely different for his extremely compressed Yuanying. It couldn't contain even a trace of impurities. Otherwise, if the density was too high, it would create cavities and cracks in the Yuanying cultivator's body. In serious cases, it could even cause the Yuanying cultivator's body to collapse. Only the purest Yuanying cultivator's body could avoid this situation. Therefore, he wouldn't eat a single Yuanying cultivator's pill. Freakish explosive power, freakish spirit, freakish swordsmanship, and freakish flying sword. This was the impression he left on others as soon as he started fighting. If he couldn't endure it, he would die. If he did, he would have already run away. With a relatively meager amount of energy, coupled with a terrifying outburst, it would be a disaster if he persisted. To him, increasing the amount of energy was a long process that required time. Therefore, the only thing he could do now was to sharpen his axes faster, faster, and faster. This was the reason why he had to carefully review the battle after every battle. For example, killing those two Yuanying had taken him 4 breaths of time. How could he reduce the time to 3 breaths? Were there any flaws in the combination of Tao realms? Can't you change the rhythm a little more? Was there any deviation in the timing? Which movement of the body was necessary, which was unnecessary, and so on. Battle required talent. Kao understood this point quite well. However, what was more important was a surging heart to kill. She simply didn't have the mentality of a hero who could kill tens of thousands of people. This was the real reason. There was no need to explain or nurture them. If everyone in the cultivation world had such an attitude, the cultivation world would be finished sooner or later. I'm fine. Here, what are we going to do? After 3 hours, Kawa had completely recovered. She suddenly realized a problem. Here, why can you enter the bottomless ruins cave? Don't tell me that your Tao realm is the great void after you reach nascent soul. I know very well that there is no great void Tao realm like you. It's not weak at all. Lu Xiaoyi fooled her. Senior sister, one look and I can tell that your Tao realm is not deep enough. The deepest love is hatred. The most illusory is reality. I'm already weak to a certain extent. Seeing Kawa's unfriendly gaze, he laughed dryly. I cheated to get in. Ka was already immune to this person's strangeness. He even dared to cheat a half-immortal Khanate spiritual treasure. What was in his heart? How did you know that I would come to the bottomless ruins cave? Is it because of my mother? Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Thankfully, perfected Jia prepared the sudden inspiration item. Otherwise, I might not have been able to make it here. This place is too big. It's too troublesome to find one person. Perfected Jia is waiting for you outside. She told me to tell you that you have to listen to everything I say inside. Don't throw a tantrum or put on airs. Jiahua was dubious. Mother wouldn't say something like that. She would definitely give you great medicine in exchange for your help. Hey, since you don't need the Great Void Fragment, I won't force you. Can we get out? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. The fragment doesn't belong to anyone, so this space won't be broken. There's no such thing as leaving halfway. Since we're here, we have to show our sincerity. Being casual will only attract attention. Therefore, senior sister, release your Great Void Dao Realm. Let's go and try our luck. It'll save us the trouble of running away when we see people. Who knows? They might sense your aura and run away first. Kawa didn't have any objections. This was the difference in confidence. Different cultivators would have different ways of doing things. She could only be careful along the way. In the end, she encountered a lot of trouble. Unlike this guy, who swaggered along the way, nothing happened. When you meet a hoodlum, the more you hide, the more trouble you'll cause. However, if you wander around the streets like a hoodlum, it'll be the other people's turn to avoid you. She didn't like being a hoodlum, but she had to admit that the way of hoodlums was also a way. Along the way, she finally understood how a hoodlum was cultivated. If you met someone who was guilty and ran away, there was no need to chase them. If you met someone who didn't run away, the hoodlum would definitely provoke them first. If you met a Taoist, there were more ways to provoke them. You would approach them instantly, speak without restraint, be arrogant and overbearing. If you met a monk, you would directly attack with your sword. His hoodlum's 3 axes would generally cause people below 3 people to quickly retreat after suffering a great loss. After all, everyone was here to look for fragments, not to fight with a lunatic. After wandering around, everyone in this area knew that there was such a duo. There was such a sword lunatic who specialized in finding people to fight. There was even a subsidy at the back. Everyone suspected that this guy didn't have the Great Void Dao Realm, because he didn't show any signs of it at all. However, this was the problem of the ruins of the end. They couldn't care less. If such a sword lunatic who probably didn't have any needs to fight with you, and his sword skills were abnormally terrifying, would you be willing? Hence, everyone avoided him. They didn't want to lower themselves to the same level as a lunatic. In this space, I only have one ear to shoulder. Lu Xiaoyi was proud of himself. Kawa was speechless. The heavenly Tao was unfair. It was always more tolerant to the wicked. This was also the nature of humans. It was like this in the mortal world, and it was the same in the cultivation world. The key was that this kind of hooligan wasn't something that a person could pretend to be. Lu Xiaoyi was still bragging. How can there be a real hooligan in this world? It's all an act. It's just that for someone like me, it's more difficult to force out my good nature. I have to bleed and die. Can't do it? Then I'm a real hooligan. Kawa sighed. This guy wasn't talking nonsense. Just by looking at how he had chosen people to go to the Shaking Shadow Festival, she knew that this was the nature of this person. What a hooligan. He still had some true temperament. She had always suspected that this guy had some ulterior motive and was harboring evil intentions. Now this thought had faded. He could do whatever he wanted. It was unrealistic to expect a hooligan to be honest and abide by his own rules. Then again, you could not be a hooligan, but you had to know a hooligan. It was very beneficial, much more useful than knowing some sanctimonious gentleman. Chapter 978. When the great Tao fragment appeared, every cultivator within could sense it. Although they did not know its exact location, they were certain that it had been released by the ruins of the end. At this time, The number of people in the Chunji space was no longer the 100 people who had just entered. Instead, it was reduced to 60 or 70 people. Basically, it was a battle between Buddhists and Taoists. Lu Xiaoyi had also contributed a lot to it. The pace of the battle suddenly became much faster. All the cultivators expanded their Tao state to the maximum, hoping to find traces of the fragment. Until now, no one could confirm whether the fragment in the Chunji space was a merit fragment or a great void fragment. Everything was still unknown. At this time, there were fewer battles. Everyone was anxious to find the fragment and decide how to distribute it. Only then could there be a large-scale battle. It was not that one party would give up after the fragment was confirmed. In the cultivation world, this was impossible. For example, if the fragment was found to be a great void fragment, the monks would definitely come and cause trouble. If they could not get it, no one else could. In the end, the Taoist cultivators would fight among themselves for the fragment, and the Buddhist bodhisattvas would consciously hunt them down. That would be the real bloody moment. On the other hand, if it was a merit fragment, the Taoists would do the same. In the entire space, there was a group of headless flies circling around. Lu Xiaoyi reminded, "Senior sister, once I find the exact location of the fragment, I will go over. What you need to do is to move in the opposite direction. At this time, everyone will focus on the fragment. No one will pay attention to a delicate beauty. When there is a result, the space will shatter, and we will naturally leave." Kawa nodded. She knew that he was right. Such a chaotic battlefield was most suitable for hooligans. She would not be of any use if she stayed here. You should be careful. Some dangers are actually due to arrogance. I don't need to say this. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. I am in charge of this space. Without my permission, who dares to interfere in the distribution of the good stuff? Once the fragment appeared, it was quickly discovered by the cultivators who searched in all directions. Lu Xiaoyi was not there, but a Taoist cultivator passed by. He released his divine sense and shouted, "There is a fragment in the direction of the asteroid. It is a merit fragment." This was the rhythm of summoning people to cause trouble. Lu Xiaoyi rushed towards the asteroid as if he had been injected with chicken blood, leaving behind Ka, Wahoo sighed, and retreated in the opposite direction. Without a rogue's heart, one would not be able to do rogue things. Lu Xiaoyi quickly rushed to the location where the shard had appeared. Along the way, there were monks and Taoists. The only difference was that the Taoists used their spells to obstruct him, while the monks were focused on rushing. Lu Xiaoyi did not look for trouble with the monks. To him, the most important thing was to rush to the scene and find an opportunity to see if he could obtain this merit shard, just like how he obtained the Great Void Fragment. Although the merit shard was not very useful to him, it was still good to be a target for Qi Yi in the Sparrow God space. He could also annoy the Buddhists, killing two birds with one stone. His advantage lay in the fact that cultivators who truly wanted to fuse with the shards, regardless of whether they were monks or Taoists, would require a relatively quiet environment and a process. This was the normal process of fusing with the shards. It required digestion and absorption. He didn't need that. His method wasn't to fuse with the shards, but to plunder and swallow them whole. There was no process, so the chances were great. After flying for a short while, the front was already in a mess. This time, the monk's discipline was useless in front of the merit shard. There were many types of Buddhists. They came from different worlds, different monasteries, and different inheritances. The Buddhist ideology they believed in was no less than that of Taoists. When there were no benefits, they could still combine. Now that there was a merit shard, who would care if they were the same Buddhist lineage? You can take it, but I can't. At the core, there were 20 to 30 monks in a tangle. Some were talking about Buddha, some were pretending to be Vajra. Outside, there were Taoists. They attacked when they were cold and harassed as much as they could. No one had enough space and time to fuse with the merit shard. The monks did not have any good ideas. If they chased, the Taoists would run away. They couldn't give up the shard that was so close to them just to kill them, right? If they didn't chase, these annoying Taoists would never stop. The same situation was probably happening in the other 11 ultimate spaces. It was just that the monks and Taoists were suffering. When Lu Xiaoyi arrived, he took the lead and rushed in. As the leader of the hoodlums, he had to take on the responsibility of a leader. There were bold Taoists following behind him. Although there weren't many of them, the 6 or 7 of them who only cared about causing trouble and did not seek profits had indeed brought endless trouble to the monks. He knew very well that this wouldn't last for long. The monks were not scattered sand after all. When he united again and made expelling the Taoists their top priority, it would be the moment they would be in trouble. Relatively speaking, there was not a single monk who came here. However, not every Taoist would come here. There were also many who were in the same situation as Kawa. They didn't care about the matter and just let it go. In terms of numbers, the monks had the absolute advantage. Lu Xiaoyi's goal of rushing in was only to find out the exact location of the shard. After rushing in twice, he left behind a mess. The situation had been ascertained, but Lu Xiaoyi was still pretending. Everyone, if we rush in again, I believe the monks will join hands. So after rushing in, don't look back. Run out together. Let's wait for them to fight among themselves. After a while, we will come back to care about them. The Taoists laughed. This was the right thing to do. Although they were causing trouble, they were just venting. They didn't want to die here. This time, the 10 or so Taoists worked together. They used restrictive spells to open up a path, threw enchantments randomly, used demonic beasts to charge forward, and used flying swords. Because this was the last time, they wanted to pierce through each other. Therefore, they pierced deeper than the previous 2 times. It was so deep that it was close to the floating merit shard. The monks were also in a difficult position. They had not yet organized. Some of them contributed, and some of them wanted to take advantage of the shard. They couldn't resist the sudden rush of the Taoists. Considering that these Taoists couldn't take away the merit shard, they could only pretend to be obedient and open a path. However, in this way, they might have to spend more effort to surround the shard. There was nothing they could do. In the cultivation world, how could it be easy to harvest? There were always countless flies buzzing around. The leader of the flies had already found a position. Under the cover of a dazzling spell technique, the peacock god disappeared in a flash. The next moment, the space trembled. Everyone was ejected to the space they were originally in. When they looked up, only 11 light pillars were still hanging in the air. The one that belonged to Chunji had already disappeared. A monk shouted, "True Lord Dong! True Lord Dong! The merit shard hasn't been combined. How can the space be removed?" Chapter 979. The monks who felt that it was unfair protested against it, but there were also some clever ones who would not be affected by such an accident. Some people tried to crash into the other light pillars with the hope that they would be able to get in. Wouldn't that be another chance? Of course, such a situation would not be allowed under normal circumstances. However, because of the arrival of the Buddhist monks, the cave of the ruins of the end had allowed them to enter again in order to reduce the number of cultivators. Wouldn't more cultivators die if they entered a few more times? For example, in the fight in the Qinji space, there were only about 60 to 70 cultivators who had entered. They did not achieve their goal at all. Therefore, they just watched as the cultivators continued to enter. Kawa heard a voice saying, "Stay where you are." The hooligan had already entered another light pillar. Was he still not satisfied? Speaking of which, who took the Chunji space's merit fragment? This dead person did not even say a word. How worrying. Lu Xiaoyi entered the Inji space again. He did not have any other intentions and chose randomly. He had to hurry up. In theory, if he wanted to fuse the fragments, he had to completely eliminate one side and suppress the other competitors of the same orthodoxy. This required a lot of time. However, he was afraid of accidents. In the cultivation world, Lu Xiaoyi was not the only one with special abilities. In a chaotic world, there were bound to be demons. The Inji space was already in a mess. The momentum was even greater than that of the Chunji space. Lu Xiaoyi took a closer look and could not help but laugh out loud. This was still the merit fragment. The monks gathered into a group to protect the fragments. They argued with each other while dealing with the annoying Taoist flies. It was the same situation as the Chunji space, but there were more people and the battle was more intense. He was not alone. There were a few monks and a few Taoists who rushed in with him. The Taoists were very disappointed because they did not find a suitable fragment for themselves twice. However, the monks were very excited because they had gotten another chance. The Taoist participation was welcomed by the Taoist Yuanian group. There were more flies. This was good news. However, the addition of these monks made the monks at the scene very dissatisfied. One monk reprimanded. The competition in the Chunji space is over. Why are you still here to snatch food? My Buddha is merciful. Abstain from greed and lust. Hurry up and leave. The monk who had just entered was equally displeased. Since you can enter, then this is the law of the sinkhole space. The Great Tao fragment is an ownerless item, so what right do you have to say that it's yours? My Buddha is merciful. The bestowal of the Great Way should belong to those who are virtuous. How can there be such a thing as first come, first served? In the chaos, it was impossible for Lu Xiaoyi to instigate the Taoists to launch a group attack like last time. However, he could still take advantage of the chaos with his unpredictable escape skills. As long as there was chaos, there would be a place for him to use his skills. The good thing was that no one here knew about his background. A wasp had sneaked into a swarm of flies. In the Inji space, the Taoists were slightly organized. There were two powerful Taoists whose origins were unknown. Under their organization, the Taoist harassment seemed to be very organized. It was also because of the deep hatred between the two. They vented their anger at not being able to see the great void fragment on the monks. Lu Xiaoyi was obediently assigned to the different levels of attack. He took turns to attack. Some were the main attackers, while others were the backup. The Taoists were having fun. They took advantage of the monks' weakness of not being able to leave the merit fragment and gave them a good beating. There were very few deaths, and they did not pursue such an effect. This was because doing so would cause the monks to fight to the death. There was only one goal. Even if you had the merit realm, you would still not be able to obtain the fragment. Lu Xiaoyi hid in the Taoist group. After 3 jumps, he had a rough idea of the fragment's location. On the 4th attack, he attacked a monk who was close to the fragment. At this time, the battlefield of dozens of people was extremely chaotic. Spells versus Dharma. Enchantments versus the Buddhist kingdom. Light and shadow intertwined, and spiritual explosions occurred frequently. It was like a dazzling large-scale stage with dazzling sound and light effects. The Taoists shuttled back and forth, randomly picking the nearest monk. Under such circumstances, Lu Xiaoyi's 7 ant, which was originally very low-key, quietly came out of its scabbard. It blended into the large-scale sound and light combination and landed on a monk. The sound of Sanskrit suddenly appeared, and the vision of Tao disappeared. Heavenly flowers fell, unwilling to die. The monks nearby were furious. They could not figure out who attacked them in the chaos, so they could only rush out and attack the Taoists nearby. Lu Xiaoyi grasped the position and teleported to the vicinity of the fragment. Once the peacock god appeared, in Kawa's eyes, the Inji space suddenly shattered, and a large group of people were thrown out. One of them just came out of the space and crashed into the Maoji space beside it. His heart was as clear as snow. Whenever this thing appeared, the space would shatter abnormally quickly. Even if he did not get the final fragment, the fragment's owner must be related to this thing. Wherever he went, he would bring disaster. However, she cannot say it. She could only count at the side and see how many spaces this guy could bring disaster to in the end. She was very curious now, curious as to where the fragments in the shattered spaces went. She was now outside, but she did not seem to see anyone who got the fragments. Was it a secret, or was there some other inside story? Following Lu Xiaoyi's entry and exit, a large number of Taoists rushed in after the shattered spaces, and the number of Taoists gathered in the remaining spaces increased. The more people there were, the more chaotic the space became. The fragments would not have the chance to be easily merged in the space, and the battle scene became more and more intense. The easier it was for others to steal the chicken. Kawa did not know about the others, so she could only keep an eye on Lu Xiaoyi. Almost every time he entered, the space would quickly shatter, and this proved her conjecture more and more. This guy, was he not afraid of eating too much? He must have some method to quickly obtain the fragments. Could it be that he really had a deep understanding of the Great Void Tao? Then, what about the merit fragments? Why were they the same? But there was something strange about this. She had already counted. This guy had entered and exited the space 6 times. Theoretically, he could have obtained 6 fragments at most. But now, the space had already shattered in 11 places. In other words, there were still 5 places that had been taken by others. The strange thing was that no one was willing to admit that they had obtained the fragments. Then, who had obtained the 5 fragments? A thought surfaced in Jiahua's mind. It should be that there was someone as perverted as that guy who was fishing in troubled waters. But she did not know if this person was a Taoist or a Buddhist. This cultivation world was really scary. Perverts were everywhere. She was really lucky to be able to retreat wisely. She was very lucky to have met here. If she had met another pervert, she was afraid that she would have been a corpse hanging in the space by now. Right? She wanted to find traces of this mysterious person. But with hundreds of people entering and exiting, how could she tell which one was the real wasp? Her intuition was that one of the 2 wasps should be bald. Chapter 980. Fellow Taoist, you seem to have lost control. The Buddhist monk could see clearly, but he could not act on his own accord. This was the rule, and also the respect he had to show his master. The bottomless abyss cave master also had a constipated expression. Its plan was very thorough. This method was also something it had learned from human cultivators in its previous life. It felt that it was very safe and could control it, but when it actually carried it out, it was completely different, because what it had learned was only superficial, the surface. Inside, the human heart was complicated, scheming against each other, deceiving and scheming. Who could teach it these things? Therefore, it seemed to be the same, but when it really started, it went astray, and among them, there were 2 pretending to be pigs to eat tigers. It was the source of all chaos and disorder. If it was in the past, if such 2 troublemakers appeared, it would definitely expel them from the bottomless abyss cave space, deprive them of their gains, and mark their memories. It would never allow such people to enter again. But this time, a part of the reason was actually because of the Buddhist monk beside it. If not for this monk, why would it choose such a scene? How could such a disorder appear in the illusion that it was most proficient in? The bottomless abyss cave really had complaints. Therefore, it might as well ignore it. In any case, it wanted to see how this monk would deal with the troublemakers. It cannot be too obvious that he favored one and discriminated against the other, right? The monk chanted softly, Amit Ba. It is not easy to choose between these 2 strange creatures. Should I deal with them together, or should I let them go? Lord of the bottomless abyss, you are the master. Everything should be according to your wishes. The bottomless abyss cave master was filled with disdain. Humans were just like this. They clearly had a plan in their hearts, but they pretended to be innocent, making it seem like they were so just. If you were so, just don't come here. Monks were like this. Taoists were the same. Humans were such hypocrites. It had nothing to do with Taoist orthodoxy. He even had to give him a way out. Yes, I have been in the universe for a long time and do not know much about the trifles of the mortal world. Why don't you make a decision? The monk declined several times, and seeing that the numinous treasure was about to lose its patience, he spoke up at the right time. These 2 people, with such a strange ability at their cultivation level, they must have a background. Although their actions were absurd, if one considered their roots, it seemed that they were not beyond redemption. It's better to give young people a chance when it comes to treating and saving people. It's not good to just kill them with a stick. The bottomless ruins cave was truly strange. Roots. Weren't there roots from the major sects and forces in the dozens of nearby universes? No matter how amazing he is, would he be worthy of our attention? The high monk shook his head and smiled. No. What can we see from his roots in the modern world? Why don't they look for their strongest past lives? Perhaps they might be able to find something? If there is indeed a powerful reincarnation memory, then it is an instinctive memory. It seems that it is excusable if it is a little overboard. Abyss of Sinkholes Cave Truth immediately understood what he meant. He was comparing his past life's achievements. Needless to say, this senior monk must know the origins of that bodhisattva. He must be the reincarnation of that bodhisattva. He did not know how many times he had reincarnated, but he must have reached a high level. That was why the suggestion was made. It meant that the bodhisattva's behavior was pardonable. It came from the instinct before reincarnation, so it was tolerable if the way he ate was unsightly. As for the Taoist, if he did not have a great background, then he was born evil and would be the target of punishment. It was very unreasonable, but it was not completely unreasonable. In the world of cultivation, ties and ties were everywhere. It was very important to have a backer and a foothold. Although they rarely said so, they would definitely do so to form good karma and provide help for their own cultivation in the future. Even if there was no help, it was good that no one came to make trouble. Look at the strongest life. Abyss of Sinkholes Cave Truth hesitated. Of course, since you want to look at one's roots, what's the point of looking at an ordinary life? If you and I work together, we will be able to do this. Looking at past lives required ability. For example, Abyss of Sinkholes Cave Truth had been immersed in this Tao for countless years, but he could only observe the past lives of human cultivators randomly. It could be the previous life or the previous few lives. He could not observe everything after 9 lives. This was also the rule of the great Tao. The further away it was, the blurrier it would be. Under the rule of the heavenly Tao, the connection between the past life and the present life would become weaker and weaker. But Buddhism obviously had other strange techniques. What the senior monk said was to work together and choose the strongest life among the 9 lives to observe. That was the conclusion. All right, let's do as you say. Let's see what kind of domineering characters they were in their past lives. Abyss of Sinkholes Cave Truth agreed. It was not that he had to follow the senior monk's wishes. Both of them were half-immortals. Who was afraid of who? The key was this opportunity. As long as he watched at this time, he would be able to learn Buddhism's ability to choose past lives to watch. This would make it much more interesting to watch past lives. It had to be said that in the cultivation world, the ingenuity of humans was something that spiritual treasures could never compare to. Using this opportunity to learn a skill, this was a win-win deal. It was worth it. The 2 half-immortals did as they thought. One wanted to support Buddhism and destroy Tao, while the other had other requests. They hit off immediately. The first choice was, of course, that bodhisattva. A bodhisattva who used special methods to seize the 5 fragments of the great Tao, silently channeling a mystic technique. It was related to the secrets of reincarnation and 3 lives. Among the innumerable fragments, they chose the most glorious one. That was a famous senior monk, his whole body full of boundless Buddhist power. Though it was only in the illusion of their past lives, the 2 of them felt dizzy just looking at him. They knew that this was the highest tier of half-immortals, or 5th decay, or 2nd severance. He was a character that was only a step away from being ranked among the immortals. Because his aura was too strong, they could not look at him for long. They only took a glance, and the 2 of them had no choice but to withdraw from the observation, calming their own instability caused by excessive exhaustion. The senior monk smiled. "What do you think, Lord of Abyss of Sinkhole?" Abyss of Sinkholes Cave Truth was very rueful. As expected of the great virtue of Buddhism, this cultivation level is something that I can never catch up to, since he is the reincarnation of such a character, to say nothing of 5 fragments of the great Tao. Even if he took all 12 fragments, it would be a matter of course. The senior monk smiled slightly. This was all within his expectations. Then, let's take a look at this Taoist Yuanying. Abyss of Sinkhole waved his hand. There's no need, right? No matter how you compare. Can you compare to this kind of great virtue that is already half a step into the ranks of immortals? I see that this person has the head of a snake and the eyes of a rat, with a crooked nose and slanted eyes, and he is not some good person. Let him spit out what he has eaten, and also teach him the rules of my origin deity tier. Not just anyone can mess around. But the senior monk was unwilling to give up. He wanted to show fairness. Looking at one, but not the other, wouldn't that be leaving words for others to talk about in the future? Amitabha Buddha is merciful. Even ants have a fair chance. When we Buddhists do things, we never take advantage of our power to bully others. Fellow Taoist, why don't you take a look? Seeing the senior monk's insistence, Abyss of Sinkhole's cave truth could only agree reluctantly. Wasn't it just seeking a so-called peace of mind? Treating it as if it did not know? Very hypocritical. The two of them silently channeled mystery again, invading 3 lives, but they had not thought that this Taoist past was unusually simple, only having 2 previous lives. They were both very ordinary, picking one of them whose aura appeared strange. In just an instant, the image was incredibly clear. There was nothing, only a sword. Abyss of Sinkhole's cave truth's legs went soft, and he knelt on the spot, unable to speak. Did not dare to look. But the senior monk was still struggling, wanting to see clearly, only to feel that sword chopping down on his head, separated by 3 lifetimes and 3 lifetimes. The half-immortal senior monk gave a wail of grief, raising his head and collapsing, his aura completely gone. Chapter 981. The cave of the ruins of the end fell out of its previous life. It only felt its heart beating nonstop, as if it was about to jump out of its throat. Of course, it did not have a heart. It was just a feeling. It felt as if the god of death had passed by its throat. It was so close, but it did not have the strength to resist. It did not even have the heart to resist. It was a human immortal. No, it should be said that it was at least a human immortal. Its identity was special, and it still had the opportunity to come into contact with the lowest level of the immortal court, the human immortal level. In its long life, it had seen a human immortal a few times, but it could be killed just by looking at 3 lives. A human immortal could not do it. Moreover, it suspected that what they saw was not its previous life at all. Even a Zenith Heaven Golden Immortal could not kill a half-immortal instantly with the power of its previous life after its collapse, right? Unless, fortunately, it was self-aware and had the experience of seeing a human immortal. It admitted its mistake immediately and took the initiative to retreat. Otherwise, there would not be 1 corpse here, but 2. After a long while, it came back to its senses and looked at the unfathomable monk in front of it. Now, he had become a corpse without a sound. With just 1 slash, his soul was destroyed, and he could not even use the Tao disappearing celestial phenomenon. This was the slash of its previous life. If it was the current life, it could not imagine. Which great god was this? Was he really reincarnated? Or did he incarnate into the lower realm? Was he protecting his primordial spirit? It could not think of it, and it did not even dare to think about it. It was afraid that it would think of a terrible disaster. No one dared to slash a connate spirit treasure. But this person was not human. Its so-called spirit treasure system was meaningless in front of such a person. Looking at the senior monk's corpse, it muttered, "You are also dead. I advise you not to look, but you refused to listen. You insisted on holding on to that hypocrisy. Now, the epitaph can be written, perished by a hypocritical glance. But I also have to thank you. Without your glance, wouldn't I have made a big mistake? Offending an existence that I can't afford to offend? I don't dare to erect a tombstone for you. I'm afraid of being targeted. At the very least, they should make do with a thin coffin. There are many void beasts in the universe. Take care of yourself. I'm afraid I can't help you much." He turned his attention back to the last unbridled space. He couldn't care less about it. He could do whatever he wanted. The only thing he had to do was to make sure that such a person wouldn't die in its territory. Absolutely not. Lu Xiaoyi was also in the Wei Ji space. This was also the last space. The great Tao fragment hadn't been fused by anyone yet. He didn't know much about what was going on outside, and he didn't realize that there was someone as abnormal as him. As soon as he came out, he immediately went in. He didn't stay outside at all. He was also racing against time to get more. In his opinion, it was normal for the fragments of other spaces to be merged with others. It was impossible for all 12 of them to be waiting for him. He was not that narcissistic. Now that he had gotten 6, he was very satisfied. Therefore, he was very relaxed. He came to the final battle scene of the Wei Ji space. This was a fragment of the Taishu space. It was surrounded by layers of Taoists. It was airtight. Because the other spaces were all broken, this was the last chance. Therefore, there were many people here. Not only were there Taoists with fantasies, but there were also monks who were holding their breath. There were hundreds of people each. It was a big scene. Although he was also one of the Taoist lineages, he came late and couldn't enter the core circle. The Taoists were guarding against him more seriously than the monks. It made him speechless. His devouring phoenix god was not a flying sword. It couldn't travel far and couldn't pass through layers of barriers. Therefore, he could only wander around the periphery of the Taoist circle, waiting for an opportunity. The periphery of the Taoist circle was a very awkward position. It was still far from the fragments of the Taishu space, but close to the monks outside. He couldn't get any benefits, but he had to fight first. It was very frustrating. As the ancestor of scheming people, he would never show his strength in such an environment. There was a time limit to his strength. He had also consumed a lot of energy after robbing 6 spaces. He was not that stupid to show his strength here. He was very calm. If there was an opportunity, he would attack. If there was no opportunity, he would give it up. After all, he was a fellow Taoist. There was no psychological barrier. If others attacked him, he would pretend to be polite. If others chased him, he would run away. He didn't stand out in the crowd, because almost all the Taoists in the periphery had the same mentality. They couldn't fight to the death for the fellow Taoists inside, right? The benefits belonged to others. No one would be so stupid to risk their lives for themselves. Therefore, the Taoist circle was a loose one. When the monks gathered and rushed in, the Taoists in the periphery scattered and ran far away. They watched the Taoists in the core circle who wanted to take the benefits by themselves. When the core circle couldn't hold on anymore, they would rush in together. They wanted to see if they could take advantage of the situation. This cycle repeated over and over again, making choices in the greedy hearts of the people. The monks were much more scheming. They didn't want to occupy the space around the fragment. It was useless even if they did. They couldn't merge with the fragments either. They only had one goal, which was to devour the Taoists' strength gradually. It seemed that if the Taoists couldn't work together, it was possible that they would all die here. Compared to the current situation, there were nearly 300 monks and only 200 Taoists. The situation was very bad. The cultivators from the 7 great Tao sects of the Great Zhou immortal upper realm who were guarding the fragment were mainly cultivators from the 7 great Tao sects of the Great Zhou immortal upper realm. After all, they were the largest group of forces in the surrounding dozens of universes. However, when Lu Xiaoyi asked to join them, they ignored his request. One Ear's reputation was well known in the Jindan, Zhou Xian, Jindan group. However, he was nothing in the Yuanying circle. This circle not only looked at strength, but also seniority. Lu Xiaoyi's strength had not been revealed yet, let alone his seniority. It was normal for them to reject him. Just because you were from Zhou Xian, you were not qualified to get close to the fragment. That was good too. Lu Xiaoyi was naturally just a bystander outside, and was not swayed by their crisis at all. If they really pulled him in, would he contribute or not? This chaos would continue for a long time. Firstly, there was the endless harassment from the Buddhist bodhisattvas. Secondly, there was disunity within the Taoists. who would integrate was a big problem. The dozens of Taoists in the core circle were secretly using their yin force. In the end, they used their own strength. No one was willing to cooperate with the fragment. It was a tug of war. No one was able to gain an overwhelming advantage in the great void realm. Each of them pulled their own set, and the result of the 10 or so donkeys pulling randomly was easy to imagine. However, Lu Xiaoyi was not concerned about this. He was observing a monk, a low-key but powerful monk. This monk did not stand out among the monks. He did not have any treasures protecting him, nor did he have the light of Buddha. When he attacked, there was no Buddhist kingdom. When he escaped, there was no Vajra following him. He was just an ordinary monk. He rarely attacked. He only attacked 3 times, but 3 Taoists died in his hands. In the storm of spells, no one knew who attacked. However, Lu Xiaoyi knew. This was because the monk used the Buddhist swastika. Qing Xian was injured by the swastika. This made him especially alert. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.